On August 10th, 1741, somewhere in the North Pacific at sunset, a scientist leaned over the railing of a dying ship and saw something he could not explain. The animal stayed beside the vessel for nearly 2 hours, watching the crew in complete silence. It was roughly 5 feet long, covered in reddish-gray fur, with pointed ears, a dog-like head, and a tail divided into two uneven lobes, like a shark's. It played with a piece of seaweed while studying the ship, tossing it into the water and catching it again. The man watching it was Georg Steller, one of the most precise naturalists of the 18th century. Every other animal he documented on this same voyage was eventually confirmed real. Several are now extinct. The sea cow disappeared within 27 years of its discovery. The spectacled cormorant vanished within a century. The northern fur seal was pushed to the edge of collapse, but the one animal Steller could never collect became something else entirely. He called it Simia marina danica, the Danish sea ape. Over the next 70 years, 4 separate scientists attempted to classify it formally. All failed. By 1882, the animal had been erased from scientific literature completely, not disproven. Erased, and yet the description itself remained deeply strange. Steller was an experienced anatomist who knew seals, sea lions, otters, and whales intimately. He described this creature separately from all of them. He even fired a shot at it, missed, and watched it vanish beneath the water forever. The sea ape became the only creature from Steller's voyage that left behind no bones, no specimen, and no proof it ever existed at all. If you're tucked in right now, phone dimmed, trying to let your brain slow down, this one was made for you. Give it a like, subscribe if you haven't, it's free, and it helps our channel more than you can imagine. And let me know in the comments, where are you watching from, and what time is it where you are? Let's begin. Long before the waters around Alaska carried Russian hunting ships or floating processing stations, before charts of the North Pacific were complete enough to trust in winter storms, the Russian Empire began pushing eastward across Siberia with the slow determination of ice spreading over dark water. Forests, rivers, mountain corridors, and frozen coastlines were crossed not by a single expedition, but by generations of traders, soldiers, missionaries, and surveyors moving toward a horizon nobody in St. Petersburg fully understood. By the early 18th century, the empire had reached the Pacific, yet one uncertainty still lingered over every map. No one in Europe could say with certainty whether Asia and North America touched somewhere in the polar north, or whether a hidden strait divided them. The answer carried enormous consequences. If the continents were connected, territorial claims shifted, trade routes changed, naval strategy changed with them. Understanding orders first issued by Peter the Great and continued after his death under Empress Anna, the Russian state assembled what became known as the Great Northern Expedition, an undertaking so vast that it unfolded across nearly a decade and stretched from the Baltic Sea to the edge of the Pacific Ocean. Thousands of laborers, sailors, officers, interpreters, scientists, and convicts moved supplies through Siberia by river barge, horseback, sled, and foot. Entire settlements were drawn into the logistical machinery required to support the expedition's movement eastward. Among the scholars attached to this enormous imperial project was Georg Wilhelm Steller, born in the Bavarian town of Bad Windsheim in March of 1709. He had studied at the University of Halle, where medicine, botany, anatomy, and natural philosophy intertwined into a single discipline built around close observation. Steller belonged to a generation of naturalists who believed the world could be understood through relentless documentation, through patient attention to feathers, bones, plants, organs, weather, and behavior. He carried notebooks the way soldiers carried weapons. Reaching the expedition itself became an ordeal measured in years. Steller departed St. Petersburg in the winter of 1738 and traveled east across Siberia through conditions that repeatedly stalled caravans and shattered supply chains. Roads dissolved into marshland during warmer months and vanished beneath snow in colder ones. Rivers became highways and then obstacles depending on the season. By the time he reached Okhotsk nearly 2 years later, he had crossed a continental wilderness larger than most European kingdoms combined. In June of 1741, the expedition finally sailed from Petropavlovsk harbor. Two ships entered the northern Pacific, the St. Peter under the command of Vitus Bering, and the St. Paul under Alexei Chirikov. Steller boarded as expedition naturalist under appointment from the Imperial Academy of Sciences. His task sounded simple on paper. He was expected to record every plant, mineral, bird, fish, and mammal encountered during the voyage. In practice, the assignment bordered on impossible. The relationship between Steller and Bering deteriorated almost immediately. Bering was exhausted, chronically ill, cautious to the point of paralysis, and increasingly irritated by scientific delays. Steller moved with obsessive urgency. Every coastline represented undiscovered life. Every missed landing felt unbearable to him. He argued constantly for more time ashore, more opportunities to collect specimens, more freedom to investigate the unfamiliar environments sliding past the hull. He was denied almost all of it. Across the entire voyage, Steller was allowed onto land only twice. The first landing lasted 10 hours on Kayak Island in July of 1741. In that brief span, he identified 6 previously undescribed species, including the blue-black bird that would later bear his name, Steller's jay. The pace of his observations astonished even later naturalists, reading his notes decades afterward. It was the work of a man who looked at the world as though time itself were collapsing around him. Weeks later, the ships turned westward again, carrying exhausted crews through cold waters under weakening skies. Scurvy had begun moving through the men aboard the St. Peter. Bodies softened, gums bled, fatigue settled into every movement on deck. Somewhere near the Shumagan Islands, with the expedition already fraying into sickness and silence, Steller leaned against the railing and noticed something watching the ship from the water. The surviving account does not begin with excitement or confusion. It begins with the calm tone of a field observation, written by a man trained to separate attention from emotion. In his private travel journal, later published after his death under the title Journal of a Voyage with Bering, Steller wrote that on the 10th of August, they encountered a very unusual and unknown sea animal, adding that he intended to give a brief account because he had observed it continuously for 2 full hours. Even in translation, the language feels measured, almost restrained, carrying the rhythm of a naturalist arranging details carefully onto paper before memory could soften them. What follows is not the language of folklore. Steller organized the animal anatomically, moving from head to tail with the same observational structure he used elsewhere for birds, seals, and fish collected during the expedition. The head, he wrote, resembled that of a dog. The ears stood upright and pointed. The eyes were large and dark. Whiskers hung from both lips in long strands that curved downward along the face. In the phrasing of the 18th century, he compared the appearance to depictions of East Asian facial hair familiar to European illustrators of the period. The body itself appeared elongated, rounded, and thick through the middle, before narrowing gradually toward the tail. Most unusual of all was the apparent absence of forelimbs. Steller noted specifically that he could see neither forefeet nor fins, As the creature moved through the water beside the ship, the tail remained fixed in his memory with particular clarity. Rather than tapering into the shape expected of an otter or seal, it divided into two separate lobes. The upper lobe appeared substantially larger than the lower, giving the rear portion of the animal a silhouette more suggestive of a shark or cetacean than any familiar pinniped. Its coloration shifted subtly under the evening light. He described the body as mostly reddish in tone, grayer along the back, and pale reddish-white beneath, the colors changing with the angle of the sea and the movement of the animal near the surface. For long stretches, the creature remained near the vessel, repeatedly lifting the front portion of its body from the water, as though studying the men aboard the St. Peter with equal curiosity. At one point, Steller observed it playing with drifting seaweed. The animal held the kelp in its mouth, tossed it away, retrieved it, then repeated the motion again and again while remaining alongside the ship. The image possesses an almost unsettling stillness within the diary, not because the behavior itself was impossible, but because Steller described it with such clinical patience. He did not embellish the moment, he simply recorded it. As he searched his memory for comparisons, older books surfaced in his mind. Steller noted similarities between the animal before him and an illustrated creature appearing in Conrad Gesner's Historia Animalium, a vast 16th century encyclopedia of natural history that collected animals from observation, rumor, classical texts, and medieval reports. Among its pages appeared an image labeled Simia marina, the sea ape. Steller also connected the sighting to descriptions preserved by the French naturalist Guillaume Rondelet, whose own studies of marine life blended direct anatomy with inherited classical tradition. These comparisons mattered because they reveal the intellectual world Steller inhabited, a world where the borders between confirmed species and inherited accounts were still porous along the edges. Eventually, observation gave way to instinct. Collecting a specimen remained the accepted method of turning an unknown animal into scientific fact. Steller retrieved his gun and fired from the deck. The shot missed. The animal disappeared beneath the surface and did not return. Years later, scholars noticed something delicate but important within the record. The sea ape never appeared in Steller's formal scientific reports submitted to the Academy. It survived only inside his personal journal, among the quieter pages of a dead man's notes, written in the same precise hand that described every other living thing he encountered on the voyage. Natural history in the 18th century depended as much on the observer as the observation itself. Vast regions of the planet still existed in fragments of testimony, carried home by sailors, merchants, missionaries, and physicians, each account filtered through memory, weather, translation, and rumor. A strange animal described by an unreliable traveler dissolved almost immediately into myth. A strange animal described by Georg Wilhelm Steller settled differently onto the page. His contemporaries understood this long before later historians revisited the sea ape account, because by the time his journals circulated through scientific circles, Steller had already established a reputation for seeing living systems with unusual sharpness. The brief landing on Kayak Island remained the clearest demonstration of that precision. Steller spent only 10 hours ashore before Bering forced the expedition back to sea, yet within that single morning, he moved through the coastal forest with an intensity that bordered on relentless. Birds, plants, shoreline traces, and signs of human habitation all entered his notebooks almost simultaneously. He described a dark-crested jay with blue wings and a harsh voice echoing through the spruce canopy, the bird later becoming known as Steller's jay. He documented additional species unfamiliar to European science, including a small blue-gray flycatcher moving through the island brush. More quietly, he also recognized evidence that the land belonged culturally and geographically to North America rather than Asia. Tools, dwellings, and material traces left by indigenous communities revealed connections extending across the continent itself. The strange irony woven through Steller's legacy begins there. Of all the creatures eventually carrying his name, the jay discovered during those few hurried hours became the most stable survivor. The forests of western North America still hold its calls among cedar and pine, while many of the larger marine animals tied to Steller's work drifted toward decline, rarity, or extinction in the centuries that followed. The smallest encounter outlasted the grandest discoveries. His scientific descriptions endured because they possessed a rare combination of detail and restraint. Steller did not write loosely. Anatomical structures were recorded carefully, often comparatively, with attention to texture, movement, coloration, and proportion. Modern zoologists still consult portions of his observations on marine mammals because the descriptions preserve biological information unavailable anywhere else. His account of the sea cow, in particular, contains behavioral and anatomical notes later supported by genetic and skeletal research centuries after his death. Even in translation, the precision remains visible. Muscles, skin, feeding patterns, vocalizations, and social behavior appear in his writing with the quiet steadiness of prolonged attention rather than excitement. Naturalists who inherited his manuscripts recognized this quality immediately. Several later scholars described his field observations as exemplary for the period, not because they were dramatic, but because they resisted dramatization. He observed first and interpreted later. The structure of his notebooks reflected medical training as much as natural philosophy, each detail arranged almost diagnostically, as though every living thing carried a physical logic waiting to be read correctly. This becomes especially important when later scientists attempt to explain away the sea ape as a misidentified northern fur seal. Steller was not unfamiliar with fur seals. During the long isolation on Bering Island after the wreck of the St. Peter, he observed them extensively in the wild and became the first European naturalist to describe the species directly from life. His notes on their movement, body structure, whiskers, swimming posture, and colony behavior are thorough enough that later marine biologists still recognize their accuracy. He understood the difference between a seal moving through water and something behaving outside those familiar patterns. Accepting the fur seal explanation therefore requires accepting something more specific than simple error. It requires imagining that a man who had already demonstrated extraordinary reliability in observing marine mammals spent 2 uninterrupted hours watching a known species closely enough to attempt collecting it, yet failed to recognize it as an animal he would later describe correctly elsewhere. Some scholars remain comfortable with that possibility, others hesitate. More than 2 centuries later, zoologist Carl Schuker reflected on this tension while reviewing Steller's writings. He noted that it seemed highly improbable that an observer so experienced and so methodical in recording what he saw would completely mistake an ordinary seal or otter for an unknown creature if that was truly all it had been. The sentence lingers not as proof, but as acknowledgement of the unusual weight carried by Steller's attention. Wooden expedition ships carried their own atmosphere after enough months at sea. Tar, damp canvas, spoiled food, lamp smoke, unwashed clothing, animal hides, seawater, and sickness slowly blended together into a dense enclosed world that clung to the lungs and skin of everyone aboard. By the beginning of August in the year 1741, the St. Peter had become such a place. The voyage no longer resembled a triumphant scientific mission pushing into unknown waters. It had narrowed into endurance. Men moved carefully through the cramped spaces below deck, conserving strength they no longer possessed in abundance. Scurvy had spread steadily through the crew. Gums swelled and darkened, old wounds reopened, teeth loosened, muscles weakened until ordinary labor became exhausting. Sailors who had once climbed rigging with ease now struggled to stand for long periods against the movement of the ship. The disease moved quietly at first, then all at once, transforming the emotional rhythm of the vessel as much as the physical condition of the men. Vitus Bering himself had become severely ill by this stage of the expedition. Contemporary accounts describe him remaining in his cabin for extended periods, too weak to command directly for much of the return voyage. Within only a few months, he would be dead. Modern medicine understands scurvy as a deficiency of vitamin C, but 18th century crews experienced it as something stranger and more consuming than simple malnutrition. Advanced cases altered mood and perception, along with the body itself. Sailors drifting toward the final stages described confusion, emotional collapse, vivid dreams, hallucinations, and a sense of detachment from ordinary reality. Long voyages across isolated seas already strained the mind through monotony and fear. Scurvy deepened that strain into something heavier, a slow dimming of clarity beneath constant cold and exhaustion. Steller stood somewhat apart from the worst effects during this period because he had behaved differently from many aboard the ship. During the brief landing on Kayak Island, he gathered edible plants and consumed fresh vegetation whenever possible, understanding instinctively what the others dismissed or distrusted. He also ate wild game collected ashore. In his writings, he expressed open frustration toward crew members who refused unfamiliar foods even as illness advanced through the vessel around them. That frustration did not spare him from the emotional atmosphere surrounding the expedition. For months, he had lived among suffering men, trapped inside shrinking physical and psychological space, watching morale decay alongside physical health. By August, the St. Peter had become a ship, trying desperately to return home through weakening discipline and failing bodies. The ocean around them remained vast and indifferent, while the crew itself grew quieter. Conversations shortened, labor slowed, hope narrowed into routine movement westward across cold water. The sighting occurred during sunset in the northern Pacific, where evening light in late summer travels low across the sea surface for long stretches before fading. The angle of illumination mattered. Golden light striking waves at shallow elevation can distort shape, flatten depth, and sharpen silhouettes in unusual ways. Reflections stretch, fur glows differently, small motions appear larger against dark water. Several historians and biographers later returned to these conditions while examining the sea ape account, not to accuse Steller of dishonesty, but to understand the fragile relationship between observation and circumstance. One interpretation proposed by Steller biographer Dean Littlepage and others suggests that the combination of isolation, exhaustion, emotional pressure, and difficult evening light may have shaped the encounter into something larger within Steller's perception. He was a man who trusted direct observation completely. The authority of his own eyes formed the foundation of his scientific identity. In an environment where physical suffering and psychological strain surrounded him daily, even a highly disciplined observer remained human, vulnerable to misreading unfamiliar movement at sea. Another possibility moves in a quieter direction entirely. The name Steller attached to the animal, Simia marina danica, the Danish sea ape, has led some scholars to suspect an undercurrent of private mockery hidden within the diary itself. His relationship with Bering had deteriorated steadily throughout the expedition. Steller considered the commander overly cautious, dismissive of scientific work, and personally infuriating. Bering, meanwhile, saw Steller as argumentative and disruptive. Since the sea ape appears only in the private journal and not in the formal scientific reports submitted to the Academy, some historians have wondered whether the strange designation carried an element of satire aimed at the Danish commander overseeing the voyage. The difficulty with this interpretation rests in silence. Steller died young, years before the journal appeared in print, leaving behind only the words themselves and the conditions under which they were written. Scientific naming in the 18th and early 19th centuries often resembled the slow arrangement of scattered bones across a table. Explorers returned from distant oceans carrying fragments of skin, sketches, measurements, teeth, stories, translated through several languages, and occasionally nothing at all except written observations. Taxonomy tried to impose order upon this growing flood of information, building categories sturdy enough to hold the expanding natural world together. The sea ape entered this system without the one thing taxonomy depended on most: a body. Steller himself provided the first attempt at naming the animal, though only informally within the pages of his private diary. Drawing partly from older European traditions of marine folklore and natural history, he referred to the creature as Simia marina danica, the Danish sea ape. The phrase carried layers of meaning at once. Simia marina echoed the sea ape illustrations appearing in Renaissance encyclopedias, while danica attached the creature subtly to the Danish commander, whose authority had shaped the voyage. Yet the designation never became an official species description. No preserved specimen accompanied it. No formal publication established diagnostic anatomy. The name existed only inside the drifting boundary between observation and personal notation. After Steller's death, however, later naturalists encountered the diary and attempted to stabilize the account within formal science. In the year 1792, German naturalist Johann Julius Walbaum proposed the name Siren cynocephala. The classification moved the creature into the strange territory of sirens, a category still carrying echoes of classical mythology alongside marine zoology. The species name translated roughly to dog-headed, preserving the most memorable feature of Steller's description. Walbaum's effort revealed the uncertainty surrounding the animal from the beginning. Unable to place it confidently beside seals, whales, or known marine mammals, he reached backward into older categories where mythological and biological thinking still overlapped. Only a few years later, another attempt emerged through the work of English zoologist George Shaw, influenced by recommendations from Welsh naturalist Thomas Pennant. Shaw tried, forcing the sea ape into the family of manatees and dugongs, naming it Trichechus hydropithecus, the water ape among the Sirenians. This solution created new difficulties immediately. Manatees possessed broad paddle tails, herbivorous feeding structures, and body forms poorly aligned with the animal Steller described watching the ship in northern waters. The behavioral details also resisted the classification. Yet taxonomy at the time often worked by approximation, arranging unfamiliar reports beside the nearest available anatomical relatives, whether the fit was comfortable or not. The fourth major attempt arrived in the year 1815 through German zoologist Johann Carl Wilhelm Illiger, who introduced the name Monotus simia. Again, the sea ape was pulled toward the Sirenian family, despite lingering contradictions in shape, movement, and behavior. Each scholar inherited the same problem. There was no skeleton to examine, no preserved hide resting inside a museum drawer, no skull waiting beneath careful lamplight. There were only Steller's words, detailed enough to demand attention, yet elusive enough to resist placement. The pattern becomes increasingly visible across these decades. 4 scientists studied the same description and produced 4 incompatible taxonomic destinations. The creature drifted between categories because no existing classification fully contained it. Every attempt represented less a confirmation than an act of accommodation, a gradual reshaping of Steller's account until it could fit somewhere within the architecture of known zoology. Then, in the year 1805, between the 3rd and 4th classifications, German naturalist Wilhelm Gottlieb Tilesius von Tillenau proposed a far simpler explanation. The sea ape, he argued, had never been a separate species at all. Steller had merely observed a northern fur seal under unusual conditions. No hidden marine primate existed. No mysterious sirenian lingered in the North Pacific. The entire problem dissolved into misidentification. That interpretation possessed a cold efficiency the earlier classifications lacked. It required no speculative anatomy and no unstable genus. Most importantly, it restored order to taxonomy by removing the animal entirely. Later, zoologists increasingly favored this explanation as scientific standards hardened during the 19th century. By the year 1882, American mammalogist Joel Asaph Allen dismissed several of the earlier classifications as a worthless conglomeration of marine mammal categories improperly stitched together from imagination and uncertainty. With that judgment, the formal scientific discussion largely closed. The sea ape slipped quietly out of taxonomy, leaving behind only the record of repeated attempts to name something that nobody could ever hold in their hands. Cold northern water changes the appearance of living bodies in subtle ways. Shapes flatten against the surface. Wet fur darkens and clings close to muscle. Limbs disappear beneath shifting reflections. Animals visible from the deck of a moving ship often reveal themselves only in fragments, a head lifting briefly above swells, a back curving through pale water. The suggestion of movement rather than the full clarity available on land. For many zoologists, this uncertainty forms the center of the sea ape question, because among all proposed explanations, one animal aligns with the greatest number of Steller's observations, while remaining entirely ordinary within the ecosystem surrounding the expedition. The northern fur seal belonged naturally to those waters long before European vessels crossed them in large numbers. Vast colonies occupied islands scattered across the North Pacific, particularly around the Aleutians and the waters near the Shumagan Islands where the sighting occurred. The species moved easily through cold open ocean, spending much of its life far from shore. To the sailors aboard the street, Peter, a solitary seal appearing beside the vessel, would not have represented anything unusual by itself. What matters is the possibility that unusual posture, lighting, and distance transformed an ordinary encounter into something less recognizable. A juvenile male northern fur seal reaches approximately the same length Steller estimated for the sea ape, close to 1.5 meters from head to hind flippers. Its face possesses features that readily invite comparison to terrestrial mammals. Large eyes, dark nose, long whiskers, and tapered muzzle combine into an appearance many observers casually describe as dog-like even today. Under low evening light, the contours become softer still, especially at sea level where reflected sunlight can exaggerate outlines while obscuring detail. Steller's description of the head therefore fits comfortably within the appearance of a young fur seal viewed under imperfect conditions. The most significant anatomical detail involves the position of the forelimbs. Northern fur seals possess front flippers attached relatively far back along the torso compared with many other marine mammals. When swimming near the surface, especially at relaxed speed, they can tuck these limbs tightly against the body. From above, viewed downward from the deck of a ship, the animal may appear strangely limbless. The body becomes smooth and tapered, particularly if waves conceal the lower portion beneath shifting water. Several later zoologists emphasized this point while reconsidering the sea ape account, noting that perspective itself may have erased anatomical features Steller expected to see. Norwegian zoologist Leonhard Steineger, writing in the 20th century, observed that bachelor fur seals have occasionally been documented engaging in playful surface behavior while holding their flippers close against the body. They rise vertically from the water to inspect unfamiliar objects, drift alongside floating debris, and interact curiously with seaweed or kelp. Such actions overlap unexpectedly well with the behavior recorded in Steller's journal. The so-called shark-like tail may also be less mysterious than it first appears. A fur seal's hind flippers, when extended close together behind the body, can create the impression of a divided tail structure, particularly when glimpsed intermittently through moving water. Even the strange image of the animal handling seaweed no longer appears impossible within ordinary marine mammal behavior. Sea otters are widely documented manipulating floating objects repeatedly during feeding and play. Fur seals also investigate debris and vegetation drifting at the surface. The boundary between deliberate interaction and perceived play becomes difficult to define when observing from a distance across unstable water. Taken together, these details form the strongest scientific case against the sea ape as a distinct species. No unknown marine primate is required. No vanished branch of zoology must be imagined. The explanation rests entirely within known anatomy and known behavior. Yet a quiet difficulty remains beneath the simplicity of the argument. Steller himself later described northern fur seals directly and accurately in his scientific writings after prolonged observation on Bering Island. He understood their body structure, movement, and appearance intimately enough to produce descriptions still considered reliable by marine historians and zoologists. His familiarity with marine mammals increased steadily throughout the expedition. This means the debate no longer concerns whether a fur seal could resemble the sea ape to an inexperienced sailor glancing briefly across rough water. The deeper question rests with the observer himself, a trained naturalist watching carefully for 2 uninterrupted hours at close enough range to raise a firearm and attempt collection. Marine biology contains many animals that appear strangely unfamiliar when removed from their ordinary context. Distance, lighting, weather, posture, injury, age, and the instability of open water can transform recognizable species into something briefly unplaceable, especially in regions crowded with seals, otters, whales, and drifting kelp. Because of this, the sea ape has continued to attract alternative explanations beyond the northern fur seal theory, each attempting to reconcile Steller's written account with known zoology, while preserving at least some part of his observational reliability. One possibility centers on the sea otter, an animal native to the same northern waters crossed by the expedition. Sea otters possess broad whiskered faces, rounded heads, expressive eyes, and a tendency to manipulate floating objects while resting at the surface. Modern observers routinely describe them handling kelp, shells, stones, and debris with motions that resemble deliberate play. In silhouette, they can appear oddly human-like or canine, depending on posture and viewing angle. Their thick fur also matches portions of Steller's description better than many other marine mammals. Yet difficulties emerge almost immediately. Adult sea otters possess clearly visible forelimbs even while floating, and their swimming posture differs noticeably from the elongated limbless impression Steller recorded. Size also presents problems. Large males can approach the dimensions he estimated, but the overall body proportions remain inconsistent with the tapered form and divided tail structure described in the diary. More importantly, Steller later observed sea otters extensively during the isolation on Bering Island and described them carefully in his scientific writings. Like the fur seal explanation, the otter theory requires a trained naturalist to overlook anatomical details he later documented accurately elsewhere. Another proposal reaches much farther south into the Pacific. The Hawaiian monk seal has occasionally been suggested because several physical characteristics overlap intriguingly with the sea ape account. Monk seals possess smooth, rounded bodies, large, dark eyes, short fur, and facial features capable of appearing dog-like at distance. Historically, their distribution may once have extended more broadly across portions of the Pacific than it does today. A wandering individual moving far beyond its normal range cannot be considered biologically impossible. The problem lies in geography. The modern and historical center of monk seal distribution remains tied overwhelmingly to the Hawaiian archipelago, thousands of miles from the cold northern waters surrounding the Shumagen Islands. No evidence exists for a stable monk seal population anywhere near the routes sailed by the street Peter. The theory survives only through the small but persistent possibility of a single displaced animal crossing extraordinary distances through open ocean. A more dramatic explanation emerged much later through cryptozoologist Roy McCall, who suggested a connection to the leopard seal. Leopard seals possess long bodies, elongated skulls, large eyes, and predatory expressions that can appear deeply unusual when seen at sea level. Their proportions align with some aspects of Steller's description more comfortably than smaller pinnipeds. Yet this proposal collides with an even greater geographical obstacle. Leopard seals belong to Antarctic and sub-Antarctic waters on the opposite side of the globe. No verified records place them anywhere near the North Pacific during the historical period surrounding the expedition. Other suggestions move away from distinct species entirely and toward physical abnormality. Some zoologists have proposed that Steller may have encountered a northern fur seal born with malformed or underdeveloped forelimbs. Congenital deformities occur across marine mammal populations just as they do in terrestrial animals. A seal lacking visible flippers would immediately create the elongated, limbless appearance central to the sea ape account while preserving the remaining similarities to known pinnipeds. This explanation carries a certain quiet practicality because it avoids inventing unknown species altogether. At the same time, it cannot be demonstrated from surviving evidence. No specimen exists, and no comparable documented individual from the period survives in any record. The final possibility drifts furthest from conventional zoology while remaining impossible to eliminate completely. Cryptozoologists Bernard Heuvelmans and Roy McCall both entertained the idea that Steller may genuinely have observed an unknown marine species that later vanished before science could document it properly. The North Pacific of the 18th century remained only partially explored by European naturalists, and large marine animals occasionally escaped formal recognition surprisingly late into scientific history. Still, the absence of physical evidence leaves this explanation suspended entirely upon interpretation. What remains after all these theories is not resolution but imbalance. Every explanation accounts for some features while leaving others unresolved. The northern fur seal theory remains the most scientifically stable because it requires the fewest unknowns, yet it also asks for an observational mistake unusually difficult to reconcile with Steller's established precision. The Aleutian chain stretches across the northern Pacific like fragments of drowned mountains, rising briefly through fog and weather. Volcanic slopes disappear into low cloud. Dark water folds constantly against black shoreline rock. Even in the 20th century, long after modern navigation and marine biology transformed most coastlines into mapped and measured territory, the region retained a lingering sense of partial concealment. Animals surfaced unexpectedly in those waters. Shapes appeared and vanished between swells before distance or weather could settle them clearly into recognition. In the year 1969, more than 2 centuries after the voyage of the Street, Peter, sailor and writer Miles Smeaton recorded an encounter in the Aleutian Islands that quietly reopened the old uncertainty surrounding Steller's sea ape. Smeaton was not searching for unknown animals. He was an experienced mariner traveling through remote northern waters, attentive to weather, current, and coastline in the practical way sailors often become after years at sea. During the voyage, he and 2 companions observed an unfamiliar marine creature moving near their vessel. The encounter later appeared in his book Misty Islands, written without any attempt to transform the event into sensational mystery. What gives the sighting its unusual place in the history of the sea ape is not certainty, but separation. Smeaton, his daughter, and the third witness had no knowledge of Steller's original account when the encounter occurred. The observation emerged independently, unconnected to the 18th century diary hidden deep within obscure zoological literature. Only later, after reading Steller's description, did Smeaton notice the similarities. The animal he described possessed features difficult to place comfortably within ordinary expectations. It appeared broadly seal-like, yet not entirely seal-like. The head carried a distinctly canine impression, with prominent whiskers and an elongated shape that struck Smeaton as unusual. Its movements also unsettled him in quieter ways. Experienced sailors grow familiar with the rhythms of ordinary marine mammals, the predictable rolling of sea lions, the quick disappearances of seals, the drifting behavior of otters among kelp beds. This animal lingered in memory because it seemed behaviorally unfamiliar, not merely visually unfamiliar. No photograph accompanied the encounter. No specimen surfaced afterward. The animal disappeared back into the Aleutian water, carrying nothing with it except the recollections of 3 observers. In strict scientific terms, the sighting therefore holds almost no formal weight. Taxonomy does not operate on eyewitness testimony alone, no matter how sincere or experienced the witnesses may be. Without physical evidence, an unknown animal remains outside official zoological recognition. The same evidentiary barrier that eventually erased the sea ape from formal classification also prevents the Smeaton sighting from functioning as confirmation. Yet the encounter persists because it adds another quiet layer to the pattern already surrounding the story. The waters near the Aleutians and the Shumagon Islands possess one of the richest marine mammal populations on Earth. Fur seals, sea lions, whales, porpoises, otters, and countless seabirds move through a cold ecosystem dense with life and constant motion. Under such conditions, misidentifications become not only possible, but expected. Observers at sea level encounter animals partially hidden by waves, weather, glare, distance, and shifting light. A curious seal rising strangely through the water may become briefly unrecognizable even to experienced eyes. At the same time, the region has now produced two independent reports, separated by more than 200 years, in which trained or highly experienced observers described an animal resisting easy placement within the familiar local fauna. Neither account proves the existence of an unknown species. Neither resolves the sea ape question. They simply occupy the same narrow territory between certainty and ambiguity. The resemblance between the accounts remains strongest not in anatomy alone but in atmosphere. In both cases, the observers described an encounter that felt oddly sustained, almost attentive, as though the animal itself remained engaged with the nearby vessel rather than merely passing through the water. That impression lingers softly through both narratives without ever becoming evidence. By the end of the 20th century, the Smeaton sighting had settled into the margins of marine anomaly literature, mentioned occasionally in discussions of Steller's account, yet never elevated beyond anecdote. It survives now, much as the original diary entry survives, as another small, unresolved shape moving briefly through northern water before slipping beneath the surface again. Winter arrived over the Commander Islands as wind, surf, and exhaustion closing together at once. In November of the year 1741, the street Peter finally lost its struggle against weather and navigation, driven onto the shore of what would later become known as Bering Island. The voyage that had crossed Siberia, charted northern waters, and carried imperial ambitions toward the edge of the Pacific dissolved there into wreckage, scattered along a cold coastline. Sailcloth tore apart in the storm. Timber split under repeated surf. Men weakened by scurvy stumbled ashore, carrying whatever supplies they could salvage before darkness, and weather swallowed the remains of the ship completely. Vitus Bering had by then deteriorated into near helplessness. Crew members transported him across the beach in a rough litter because he could no longer walk without assistance. The commander, who had once led one of the largest expeditions in Russian history, spent his final weeks half buried beneath sand and makeshift coverings intended to protect him from the freezing wind. In December, he died on the island, worn down by scurvy, exposure, and exhaustion before the surviving crew could escape the isolation surrounding them. Steller survived. The shipwreck transformed him from expedition naturalist into reluctant castaway, yet the months that followed became among the most extraordinary periods of observation in the history of marine zoology. Cut off from the outside world, surrounded by unfamiliar northern life, he began documenting the island and its animals with the same relentless attention that had carried him across Siberia and through the Pacific voyage itself. The waters surrounding Bering Island held creatures unlike anything European science had formally encountered before. Along the shallow coastal kelp beds moved enormous dark bodies, grazing slowly at the surface in loose groups. They drifted through the water with such calm steadiness that the survivors initially compared them to cattle feeding in flooded meadows. The animals did not dive deeply or flee rapidly. Instead, they remained near the surface among the canopy kelp, feeding continuously in the cold northern sea. Steller immediately recognized them as members of the order Sirenia, the group containing dugongs and manatees, but these animals existed on a scale no naturalist had previously described. The species later received the scientific name Hydrodamylus gigas, the giant water cow. Adult individuals reached lengths approaching 9 meters and weights estimated between 8 and 10 metric tons. Only whales exceeded them among the marine mammals of the recent geological world. For comparison, the modern dugong reaches roughly 1/3 that size, a smaller herbivore inhabiting warm, tropical waters rather than the freezing edge of the Bering Sea. The sea cows floated with permanent buoyancy because of immense layers of blubber beneath their skin. Steller noted that they could not fully submerge beneath the surface, even when disturbed. Their lives unfolded almost entirely among the upper reaches of the kelp forest, where floating vegetation remained accessible. Instead of teeth, they possessed a remarkable feeding structure built for constant grinding. White bristles lined the upper lip, gathering strands of kelp inward toward paired keratinous plates deeper inside the mouth that crushed vegetation repeatedly as the animals fed. For 9 months, Steller observed them closely. He watched family groups remain together through changing weather and tides. Smaller individuals stayed near larger adults while the herds moved slowly through feeding grounds close to shore. The sea cows appeared almost entirely without fear of humans. This lack of caution allowed starving survivors from the wreck to hunt them repeatedly for food, oil, and hide. Yet Steller's writings reveal something more complicated than simple exploitation. He paid attention to their social behavior with unusual care. When hunters struck one with a harpoon, nearby animals often remained close instead of scattering immediately into deeper water. Steller described individuals gathering around injured companions, pushing against the wounded body, or attempting to dislodge the embedded harpoons. To later readers, the scenes carry the appearance of distress or collective response, though Steller himself described the behavior cautiously, resisting dramatic interpretation even while recording it in detail. No other trained naturalist ever observed a living Steller sea cow scientifically. The species disappeared before additional researchers reached the Commander Islands in time to study it properly. Everything now known about its appearance, movement, anatomy, feeding behavior, and social structure rests fundamentally upon the notes written by a shipwrecked man surviving through an Arctic winter beside the last population on Earth. Among the scattered scientific works left behind after Steller's death, one text endured with unusual importance. De Bestis Marinis, translated as The Beasts of the Sea, appeared in publication through the Russian Academy of Sciences in the middle of the 18th century, carrying outward the observations he had written during isolation on Bering Island. For the Steller sea cow, the document became more than a field report. It became the species itself in written form, the central surviving anatomy of an animal that vanished before additional naturalists could study it alive. Steller described the sea cow's skin first because its texture immediately distinguished the animal from every marine mammal familiar to him. The hide appeared dark brown to nearly black in places, deeply roughened and uneven across the body. He compared it directly to the bark of an old oak tree, not poetically, but literally, as though the animal had grown a surface more suitable for timber than flesh. The skin resisted knives and harpoons with unusual toughness. Centuries later, genomic research published in the journal Science Advances confirmed that this observation had been startlingly accurate at the molecular level. Scientists analyzing preserved sea cow DNA identified altered versions of 2 genes associated in humans with severe thickening disorders of the skin. The bark-like texture Steller recorded beside the freezing coast of the Bering Sea reflected a genuine inherited biological condition embedded within the species itself. Beneath that skin rested immense insulation. Steller estimated the blubber layer reached nearly 10 centimeters thick in some regions of the body, an essential adaptation for an herbivorous mammal surviving permanently within Arctic water. Unlike whales that migrated through broad oceanic ranges, sea cows remained tied closely to shallow kelp habitat surrounding the Commander Islands year-round. The dense fat beneath their hide preserved warmth while allowing the animals to float continuously near the surface without sinking deeply into colder water below. Feeding occupied most of their visible lives. Steller observed the animals grazing almost constantly across the upper canopy of the kelp forest, tearing vegetation slowly into their mouths while drifting through calm coastal water. They possessed no functional teeth. Instead, coarse white bristles lining the lips guided kelp inward toward broad, keratinous grinding plates deeper inside the mouth. These structures crushed tough marine plants through repeated pressure, reducing the vegetation into material digestible within the enormous body. Because the sea cows could not submerge effectively, their feeding remained restricted to kelp floating within roughly a meter of the surface. The ecosystem itself shaped their posture, movement, and daily rhythm. The herds appeared socially organized in ways Steller found difficult to ignore. He repeatedly encountered small family groupings composed of paired adults accompanied by younger individuals. The animals maintained close proximity while feeding and moving together along the shoreline. When disturbed, the groups responded collectively rather than scattering randomly. Steller described behavior suggesting coordination and mutual attention between individuals, particularly during hunting events, when injured sea cows remained surrounded by others, attempting to stay near the wounded animal despite danger. Sound drifted quietly through these encounters. Steller wrote of sighing exhalations and low snorting noises breaking the cold air above the surface. The sea cows communicated constantly while feeding and surfacing, though the exact structure or meaning of those vocalizations vanished with the species itself. In the stillness surrounding Bering Island, the sounds became part of the island's ordinary atmosphere during the months of shipwreck survival. Movement through the water remained slow and deliberate. The front flippers acted mainly as steering limbs, while propulsion came from the enormous forked tail extending behind the body. Unlike the paddle tails of modern dugongs, the sea cow's tail resembled the horizontal flukes of a whale, broad and divided, rising and falling steadily beneath the surface as the animals moved through kelp beds close to shore. At the time Steller observed them, the entire remaining world population existed only around Bering Island and neighboring coastal waters. Based on his own estimates, perhaps 1,500 to 2,000 individuals survived there in total. The number sounds immense at first, until set against the scale of the North Pacific itself. A giant marine mammal once distributed across a vast ocean had already contracted into a final isolated refuge by the time a shipwrecked naturalist began writing down what he saw. Bones preserve histories long after ecosystems disappear around them. Buried within cave sediments, coastal deposits, and museum drawers, fragments of extinct animals continue carrying traces of ancient populations inside their cells, waiting for technologies that did not exist when the creatures themselves were alive. In the year 2021, a multinational team of researchers extracted and sequenced the nuclear genome of the Steller sea cow, reconstructing biological information from remains left behind centuries after the species vanished from the Bering Sea. The results altered the story in a quiet but profound way. Until then, the extinction of the sea cow had often been framed as a sudden catastrophe, beginning with European discovery and ending with rapid hunting pressure around Bering Island. That destruction was real and devastatingly fast, yet the genome revealed something older, unfolding beneath it. Long before Steller stood among the kelp beds watching the animals feed near shore, The species had already entered a prolonged decline stretching back hundreds of thousands of years. One of the clearest signals emerged through heterozygosity, the measure of genetic diversity within a population. The final sea cows possessed remarkably low heterozygosity, meaning the surviving animals carried unusually similar genetic material across the population. In evolutionary terms, this reflected long isolation and shrinking numbers over immense stretches of time. Researchers compared the condition directly to the final woolly mammoths that survived on Wrangel Island after mammoths had vanished elsewhere across the world. Those last mammoths persisted in genetic isolation until roughly 4,000 years ago, their dwindling diversity quietly recording the approach of extinction even before the final individuals disappeared. The sea cows showed a similar pattern. Demographic reconstruction based on the genome suggested a severe population collapse beginning roughly 400,000 years earlier during periods of climatic instability reshaping the northern Pacific. Sea levels shifted repeatedly as glacial cycles advanced and retreated. Water temperatures changed, coastlines moved, kelp forests expanded and contracted across the ocean rim. For a giant herbivore dependent almost entirely on shallow canopy kelp near the surface, these environmental transformations carried enormous consequences. During the Pleistocene epoch, stellar sea cows once occupied a range extending across nearly the entire northern Pacific margin. Fossil remains indicate populations existed from the waters near Japan through the Aleutian Chain and southward along the western coast of North America toward California. The species belonged not to a tiny, isolated refuge originally, but to a vast marine ecosystem stretching across cold coastal habitats thousands of kilometers apart. By the time the street Peter wrecked on Bering Island, that world had narrowed almost beyond recognition. The sea cows surrounding the island represented the final surviving pocket of a species already retreating for millennia. A study published the following year estimated that perhaps 200,000 individuals may once have grazed Pacific kelp forests during the height of their ancient distribution. Against that scale, the remaining Bering Island population appears hauntingly small. Fewer than 2,000 animals likely survived anywhere on Earth when Steller began observing them from the shoreline. This decline did not begin with harpoons or commercial hunting fleets. It unfolded gradually through climate-driven habitat contraction as warming and cooling cycles altered the distribution of the kelp forests, sustaining the species. The sea cows depended upon stable, shallow feeding grounds close to the surface because their immense buoyancy prevented deep diving. As those habitats fragmented across thousands of years, isolated populations vanished, one after another, until only the Commander Islands refuge remained. The genomic findings therefore changed the emotional shape of the story, without softening its ending. The hunters who arrived after publication of Steller's work still eliminated the species with astonishing speed, but they encountered an animal already biologically cornered by deep time and environmental change. The final herd carried within its DNA the signature of a long retreat already underway before any European naturalist laid eyes upon it. What Steller found beside Bering Island was not a thriving marine giant, flourishing untouched in northern abundance. He encountered the last remnant of an ancient Pacific lineage that had already spent hundreds of thousands of years diminishing toward the edge of disappearance. The notes he carried back from the island preserved the final living description of a species already balanced at the lip of extinction before human exploitation accelerated the fall. Paper moves farther than ships. Once observations leave the shoreline and enter official circulation, They detach from the conditions in which they were first written and begin affecting places the original observer never imagined. After Steller's death, the notes composed during the Bering Island shipwreck traveled westward through the administrative and scientific machinery of the Russian Empire until they appeared in publication through the Academy of Sciences in St. Petersburg. De Bestiis Marinus emerged into the world in the year 1751, carrying within it the first full description of the stellar sea cow ever read outside the isolated waters where the animal still survived. The document was not written as poetry or memorial. It functioned as practical natural history in the 18th century tradition, careful, material, and concrete. Steller explained where the sea cows could be found, the seasons during which they remained most visible near shore, the way they moved through kelp beds, and how closely vessels could approach before the animals reacted. He described their anatomy in detail because that was the responsibility of a naturalist documenting an unknown species. Yet, every anatomical detail also contained economic information waiting to be recognized by merchants, sailors, and hunters moving through the North Pacific. The sea cow's immense blubber yielded oil comparable in usefulness to whale oil, an essential fuel for lamps during long voyages through northern waters. The meat, according to surviving crew accounts, remained nourishing for extended periods without spoiling quickly, valuable for expeditions operating far from established ports or settlements. Even the hide possessed unusual utility. Thick and durable, it could be shaped into coverings for small boats and other maritime equipment after processing. The animal represented not merely food, but infrastructure, fuel, insulation, and commercial opportunity concentrated into a single, slow-moving body grazing close to shore. Word spread rapidly through the Russian fur trading networks, already expanding eastward across Siberia and into the Pacific. Within roughly a year of the publication circulating among traders and mariners, hunting parties began visiting Bering Island intentionally to harvest sea cows for provisions. The isolation that had protected the species for thousands of years dissolved almost immediately once its location and behavior entered navigational knowledge. The tragedy carried a particular efficiency because the animals had evolved in near complete absence of human predation. They did not flee aggressively from approaching boats. Their immense buoyancy, limited escape, their dependence on shallow coastal kelp kept them geographically predictable. Hunters could approach within close range and kill them systematically along the shoreline where the animals fed in visible groups. The sea cows had survived immense climatic shifts across hundreds of thousands of years, only to encounter a commercial system expanding faster than their biology could respond. Imperial authorities eventually recognized the danger. In the middle of the 1750s, scarcely 14 years after Steller first observed the species alive, the Russian government issued a decree prohibiting the hunting of sea cows around the Commander Islands. The order arrived with surprising speed for an empire spanning continents. Officials understood that uncontrolled harvesting threatened the survival of a unique and economically valuable animal. Yet, regulation moved more slowly than depletion. Remote waters proved difficult to monitor, and hunting continued despite formal restrictions. The population already stood at the edge of viability before commercial exploitation intensified. Every loss mattered. Every shoreline harvest removed animals from a herd too small to absorb sustained pressure. In the year 1768, the final confirmed Steller sea cow was killed on the coast of Bering Island. Only 27 years separated scientific discovery from extinction. No other large marine herbivore in recorded modern science disappeared so quickly after entering formal documentation. the species moved from unknown existence into permanent absence within the span of a single human generation. The irony surrounding Steller's role remains difficult to escape. During the months of shipwreck survival, he observed the sea cows with patience and unusual attentiveness, recording behavior, anatomy, and social patterns in order to preserve knowledge of a living creature previously unknown to European science. He wrote carefully because accuracy mattered to him above nearly everything else. Those same pages later functioned as instructions. The roots, feeding habits, physical usefulness, and vulnerability of the sea cow became legible to the outside world through the precision of his observations. Without intending harm, the naturalist who preserved the species for history also opened the path that led hunters directly toward the last surviving herd grazing quietly beside the kelp forests of Bering Island. Along the dark volcanic shorelines of Bering Island, another animal moved quietly through the cold northern surf while the surviving crew struggled through hunger and illness. It did not possess the enormous scale of the sea cow, nor the strange permanence that later surrounded the sea ape account. The spectacled cormorant entered Steller's notebooks, with far less mystery attached to it, and perhaps because of that, its disappearance would unfold, almost unnoticed, beyond the remote waters where it once lived. Steller encountered the bird during the same winter shipwreck that produced his observations of the sea cow. The Commander Islands held dense colonies of seabirds, adapted to isolation, and among them stood the largest cormorant species ever formally documented. The spectacled cormorant reached lengths approaching a meter and weighed between roughly 3 and 7 kilograms, depending on age and condition. Even the largest living cormorants of the modern world appear comparatively slight beside it. The bird carried a heavy body shaped by generations without serious terrestrial predators, and that isolation altered not only its size but its behavior. Its plumage appeared black at first glance, yet under direct light, the feathers reflected deep green iridescence across the surface of the body. White patches near the flanks and around the face created the feature responsible for the bird's later name, giving the impression of pale spectacles against otherwise dark plumage. Steller described the animal with the same precise attention he applied to marine mammals, recording posture, feather texture, feeding habits, and coloration without embellishment. The spectacled cormorant could fly, but only awkwardly. Its wings had not vanished in the complete manner seen in penguins or flightless rails, though they had become reduced relative to the bird's mass. Takeoff required effort and space. On land, the cormorants moved slowly and with little alarm. Evolution on isolated islands had gradually removed the urgency of escape behavior because no large land predators existed there to reward fearfulness. The birds nested, rested, and fed within an ecosystem where caution carried little survival advantage. At sea, they hunted fish through diving, disappearing beneath the freezing surface with surprising efficiency despite their heavy appearance above water. Yet when humans approached shore colonies, the birds showed little instinctive avoidance. They remained visible, accessible, and easy to kill. In another century, this vulnerability would become fatal. During the winter of the shipwreck, however, it became one of the primary reasons members of the Street Peter survived at all. Steller wrote that a single spectacled cormorant provided enough meat to feed 3 starving men. The surviving crew harvested the birds repeatedly, while storms and ice isolated them from escape. Scurvy weakened bodies already exhausted from the Pacific crossing, and fresh food became essential, not only for survival, but for morale within the temporary camp scattered along the shore. Unlike many cormorant species, whose flesh sailors often described as oily or unpleasant, the spectacled cormorant proved surprisingly edible. Steller even recorded a kamchadal preparation technique in which the birds were coated in clay, buried beneath heated earth, and slowly baked until the meat became tender and rich. The bird therefore entered European scientific history in a deeply practical way. It was not merely observed, it sustained dying men through one of the harshest winters of the expedition. Like the sea cow, the spectacled cormorant became entangled almost immediately in the expanding commercial movement entering the North Pacific after publication of Steller's notes. Its size made it desirable. Its inability to flee made it easy prey. Every vessel stopping near the Commander Islands encountered colonies of large seabirds that behaved as though humans posed no danger at all. Sailors collected them for food with astonishing efficiency. The same evolutionary calm that had allowed the species to thrive in isolation became catastrophic once regular hunting began. By approximately the middle of the 19th century, the spectacled cormorant had vanished entirely. Fewer than 100 years separated formal scientific description from extinction. Only preserved skins, skeletal remains, and Steller's written accounts remained behind. Fragments of a seabird that once stood in dense colonies above the northern Pacific while shipwreck survivors watched smoke rise from cooking pits along the frozen shore. Not every creature Steller encountered vanished into extinction or decline. One small bird remained behind in the forests of the Pacific coast, while the great marine animals surrounding it slowly disappeared from the water. There's an Herficht. The survival of Steller's jay carries a strange quietness within the larger history of the expedition, because it was the animal he knew for the shortest amount of time and perhaps the one he least expected to become his most enduring namesake. The encounter took place during a brief landing on Kayak Island in July of the year 1741. After months confined to the rolling isolation of the street, Steller finally stepped onto the North American coast with only a few hours available before the expedition continued onward. He moved urgently through the forest, collecting plants, observing wildlife, and recording anything unfamiliar before the crew forced him back toward the ship. Within that compressed window, he described multiple species new to European science, among them a dark, crested jay moving through the spruce forest with loud calls and restless intelligence. The bird later became known as Steller's jay. Cyanocheta stelleri, a forest corvid distributed along the Pacific coast of North America, from Alaska southward through mountain forests, reaching into Central America. Unlike the sea cow or spectacled cormorant, the jay occupied habitats less immediately vulnerable to the expanding maritime fur trade. It lived among forests rather than isolated shorelines. It could fly freely across broad ranges. It adapted readily to changing environments and displayed the flexible, opportunistic behavior characteristic of corvids throughout the world. Steller recognized something important about the bird almost immediately. He had read earlier accounts describing the blue jay of eastern North America, and the similarities between the two species struck him with unusual significance. The bird moving through the Alaskan forest resembled not the avian fauna of Siberia or northeastern Asia, but birds associated with the North American continent itself. From this observation, he reasoned that the land surrounding him belonged ecologically to North America rather than Asia. It became one of the earliest examples of biogeographical inference through bird distribution, a scientific deduction made not through maps or politics, but through feathers, calls, and evolutionary relationship. The moment passes quietly within the larger expedition narrative, yet it revealed the way Steller's mind worked. He did not merely catalog organisms. He interpreted patterns linking geography, climate, and life across immense distances. A single jay in a coastal forest became evidence for continental connection. The irony surrounding the bird deepened over time. Steller spent months studying the sea cow in extraordinary detail, carefully recording anatomy and social behavior while stranded on Bering Island. He observed the spectacled cormorant through an entire Arctic winter. He described sea lions, sea otters, eiders, and eagles with remarkable precision. Many of those animals later entered decline or disappeared entirely. The jay, glimpsed during one hurried morning ashore, became the stable survivor among them. Writers eventually began noticing the pattern. In the early years of the 21st century, a newspaper article referred to the phenomenon as Steller's curse, a phrase capturing the unsettling concentration of extinction and vulnerability surrounding species associated with his name. The sea cow vanished within decades. The spectacled cormorant disappeared in the following century. Steller's sea lions entered serious decline across parts of their range. Steller's eider became threatened. The great sea eagle of the Pacific hovered near vulnerability as habitat pressures and environmental change accumulated around the northern rim of the ocean. Meanwhile, the jay persisted, still moving noisily through cedar forests and mountain campgrounds, adapting to roads, towns, and fragmented woodland in ways the marine giants never could. Intelligence protected it where isolation doomed the others. Mobility protected it where geographic confinement became fatal. The broader landscape Steller documented in the year 1741 no longer exists in the form he witnessed. Kelp forests shifted under ecological pressure. Hunting fleets transformed coastlines. Entire populations contracted or vanished. Yet somewhere along the Pacific coast, a dark-crested jay still lands among wet branches and watches the forest with the same sharp curiosity that first caught the attention of a hurried naturalist stepping ashore for only a few brief hours before returning once more to the sea. Before the northern Pacific became a network of shipping routes and commercial hunting grounds, sea otters drifted through the coastal kelp forests in astonishing numbers. They floated among the canopy like dark fragments of the water itself, wrapping themselves in kelp to remain anchored against the tide while waves passed quietly overhead. Around Bering Island, Steller encountered them everywhere during the months following the wreck of the Street Peter. The animals approached shorelines without fear, surfaced near boats without alarm, and moved through the shallows with the ease of creatures that had never learned caution around human beings. Steller observed them carefully, recording details of anatomy and behavior in the same disciplined manner that shaped all his field notes. Sea otters possessed unusually expressive faces, dexterous forepaws, and dense fur unlike anything else in the marine world. What he could not fully know at the time was that the fur covering those floating bodies would soon redraw the economic geography of the North Pacific. Sea otter fur remains the densest known among mammals. Instead of relying primarily on blubber for insulation, the species survives cold water through an extraordinary concentration of hairs packed tightly across the skin, approaching nearly 1 million hairs within a single square inch in some regions of the body. The fur trapped insulating air so effectively that pelts became enormously valuable within Chinese and European trade markets, where softness, rarity, and thermal quality transformed them into luxury commodities of exceptional worth. During the shipwreck winter, members of the surviving crew killed sea otters both for practical survival and for trade potential. Hundreds of pelts eventually traveled back toward Kamchatka, alongside stories of untouched coastal populations extending across the Aleutians and beyond. The effect resembled the opening of a mineral strike or gold field. News of immense numbers of commercially valuable animals spread rapidly through Siberian trading networks, already pushing eastward toward the Pacific frontier. Within a few years, Russian promyshleniki, maritime fur hunters operating through harsh seasonal expeditions, flooded into the Aleutian Islands and the Commander Islands. Hunting camps multiplied along remote shorelines. Indigenous communities became entangled within expanding fur extraction systems driven by imperial profit and international demand. Sea otters disappeared from coastal waters with astonishing speed because their biology offered almost no protection against industrial-scale harvesting. They surfaced visibly in kelp beds. They floated rather than fled. Their curiosity often brought them closer to boats instead of farther away. By the 19th century, the transformation had become catastrophic. Historical populations, once numbering in the hundreds of thousands, collapsed toward near extinction across the Pacific Rim. In some regions, the species vanished completely for generations. By the early years of the 20th century, perhaps only 1,000 or 2,000 sea otters remained alive worldwide, fragmented into isolated pockets along coastlines where hunting pressure had failed to reach absolute completion. The consequences extended far beyond the disappearance of the otters themselves. Modern ecology later revealed that sea otters functioned as one of the central stabilizing forces within northern kelp forest ecosystems. Their primary prey included sea urchins, animals that graze aggressively upon kelp holdfasts and lower fronds. Under ordinary conditions, otters kept urchin populations controlled through continuous predation. Once the otters vanished, the balance dissolved. Sea urchin numbers exploded across large portions of the North Pacific. Dense grazing stripped kelp forests from the seafloor upward, transforming once productive underwater habitats into barren stretches dominated by spiny invertebrates and exposed rock. Entire ecological structures changed shape. Fish populations shifted, coastal productivity declined, energy flow through the ecosystem reorganized itself around absence. The genomic study examining the Steller sea cow in the early 21st century addressed this chain reaction directly. Researchers proposed that the collapse of sea otter populations may have accelerated the sea cow's final decline even before direct hunting completed the extinction process. As kelp forests deteriorated under expanding urchin grazing, the surface canopy feeding grounds sustaining the remaining sea cows likely diminished as well. The animals Steller documented beside the cold shorelines of Bering Island did not exist separately from one another. Sea cows, sea otters, kelp forests, urchins, seabirds, and marine predators formed interconnected structures operating together across the North Pacific. Removing one species altered the conditions supporting the others. Pulling enough strands from the system eventually reshaped the entire fabric of the ocean. Steller once observed, drifting quietly beyond the wreckage of the street. Peter, when the ice finally loosened its hold on Bering Island and the sea became navigable again, the survivors of the street Peter began turning wreckage into escape. Only 46 men remained alive from the original crew of 77, who had departed months earlier into the North Pacific. Scurvy, exposure, exhaustion, and the violence of the wreck had reduced the expedition steadily through the winter until the shoreline itself felt less like a camp and more like the scattered remains of a failed crossing. Using salvaged timber from the broken street Peter, the crew constructed a smaller replacement vessel directly on the island. The work unfolded slowly beneath cold wind and lingering illness. Planks from the wreck became ribs and decking. Rope, iron fittings, and fragments of sailcloth found second lives within the improvised craft. The sea cows, cormorants, and otters surrounding the island continued feeding the survivors, while the new vessel gradually took shape beside the water. In the late summer of the following year, the men finally sailed away from Bering Island and returned westward toward Kamchatka. The journey back carried with it specimens, journals, pelts, observations, and stories of a northern ecosystem still largely unknown to European science. For Steller, survival did not bring rest. Once back within Siberia, he resumed work almost immediately, moving through remote territories, collecting plants, documenting mammals and fish, and preparing materials intended for transmission to the Academy of Sciences in St. Petersburg. The years after the shipwreck became intensely productive despite the physical strain surrounding them. Steller expanded his botanical studies into what later formed the basis of Flora of Kamchatka, one of the earliest detailed scientific works describing the region's vegetation. He also contributed major observations concerning Pacific salmon, tracing migration patterns and life cycles with unusual precision for the period. Much of that work later appeared under the name of his assistant, Stepan Krasheninnikov, though later biographers and historians increasingly concluded that Steller himself had carried much of the original research burden through direct field observation. His mammal descriptions also expanded during these years. Sea lions, fur seals, otters, birds, fish, and Arctic coastal fauna entered his notes in layered detail. He continued working with the same restless intensity that had characterized him throughout the expedition, yet the conditions surrounding his life remained unstable. Siberia in the middle of the 18th century was not merely remote wilderness, but an imperial frontier governed through military authority, extraction networks, and uneasy relationships with indigenous communities spread across enormous distances. In the year 1746, Steller became entangled directly in that system. Imperial authorities arrested him on accusations that he had illegally freed a group of imprisoned Kamchatkans. The surviving documentation surrounding the case remains incomplete, yet the accusation aligned closely with patterns already visible in his writings. Steller often expressed sympathy toward indigenous Siberian populations and frustration toward the cruelty or corruption of certain colonial officials operating in the region. He began traveling westward under official summons to answer the charges before authorities in Tomsk. The journey carried him across immense Siberian distances once again, through settlements separated by forests, rivers, and frozen steppe. Before reaching his destination, he fell ill near the city of Tyumen. In November of the year 1746, Georg Wilhelm Steller died at the age of 37. The recorded cause was fever. No authenticated portrait of him survives. No verified image captures the face of the man whose observations became foundational records for entire extinct species. He remains visually absent from history, preserved only through handwriting, scientific description, and scattered testimony left behind by others. Much of the material he collected during his travels never reached permanent preservation. Specimens disappeared during transport or became scattered through archives and private collections. His papers survived more successfully than the physical evidence surrounding them. That imbalance shaped everything that followed. The man who could have clarified the sea ape account, defended his intentions, expanded upon the ambiguities in his journals, or corrected later misunderstandings, died before most of his writings even entered publication. The diary containing the sea ape observation itself remained unpublished until decades after his death, appearing in print nearly half a century after the evening when he leaned over the railing of the street, Peter, and watched an unknown shape moving through the northern water. Long after the men aboard the Street, Peter were gone, after the wrecked timber rotted into the beaches of Bering Island and the surviving journals crossed Siberia toward distant archives, the sea ape remained in an uneasy state that science has difficulty holding. It lingered not as an accepted animal, yet not entirely as a myth either. It occupied a narrow corridor between observation and proof, where a thing can be described in exacting detail and still fail to enter the official structure of the natural world. The word erased carries the feeling of intent, as though scholars gathered somewhere to suppress the account or remove it from the scientific record. The actual process was quieter than that. No decree condemned the sea ape. No institution concealed Steller's diary. What happened instead was procedural, almost mechanical, produced by the same evidentiary standards that allowed natural history to separate enduring fact from rumor. Modern taxonomy rests on a principle that became increasingly rigid through the 18th and 19th centuries. A species cannot formally exist within scientific classification without a type specimen, a preserved physical example against which all future identifications can be compared. Bones, skin, tissue, skeleton, or whole preserved body, something stable enough to anchor the name permanently in material reality. The sea ape never possessed such an anchor. There was only the written account left by Steller, several hundred words arranged with the same anatomical precision visible throughout his authenticated observations. He described proportions, coloration, movement, behavior, posture, and surface anatomy carefully enough that later naturalists repeatedly attempted classification. Yet every attempt encountered the same silent absence beneath the language. There was no specimen resting inside a cabinet, no skull in alcohol, no hide stretched for examination. Between the late 18th century and the early 19th century, 4 separate classification efforts attempted to solve that absence indirectly. Instead of declaring the sea ape an entirely new creature requiring independent physical verification, each scholar tried fitting it into an already recognized genus. One linked it to the sirens of classical natural history. Another forced it uneasily into the manatee lineage. Others adjusted the terminology while preserving the same strategy beneath it. If the animal could be absorbed into an accepted category, the evidentiary burden became lighter. None of the arrangements endured for long. The anatomy described by Steller resisted containment. Certain features resembled pinnipeds, others sirenians, others no recognized marine mammal at all. Each classification solved one part of the description while damaging another. The result became a growing pile of unstable names attached to a creature nobody could physically examine. By the year 1882, the American mammalogist Joel Asaph Allen dismissed the classification attempts entirely. His judgment was severe, but scientifically consistent. Without a specimen, formal taxonomy could not proceed responsibly. A description alone, regardless of detail, could not sustain species recognition indefinitely. In that sense, the sea ape was not expelled from science through hostility. It was excluded through the ordinary operation of scientific caution. The same standards that prevented false animals from entering taxonomy also prevented uncertain ones from remaining there. Steller himself almost certainly would have understood the logic. Throughout his career, he relied upon direct observation, preserved evidence, and comparative anatomy. He believed deeply in disciplined empirical work. The rules that ultimately rejected the sea ape were rules he practiced himself. That creates the peculiar emotional tension surrounding the account. Mechanically, the system behaved correctly. Emotionally, something still feels unresolved. The description survives with enough clarity to resist complete dismissal, yet not enough to cross the threshold into accepted zoology. What disappeared, if anything truly did disappear, was not necessarily a species, it was the possibility of certainty. Once the classification efforts collapsed and the formal conversation ended during the 19th century, the sea ape settled permanently into a suspended condition. Neither confirmed nor disproven, neither animal nor invention, it remained drifting at the edge of the historical record, carried forward only by a dead naturalist's handwriting and the memory of an evening in northern water where something lifted itself above the surface and watched a passing ship. Morning arrived slowly across the northern Pacific in the 18th century. Long bands of pale light spread across forests of floating kelp that stretched for miles beneath the cold sky, moving with the swell like submerged meadows breathing under the sea. The water around the Aleutian Chain and the Commander Islands held an extraordinary concentration of life, not because it was untouched in some mystical sense, but because geography and climate had combined to create one of the richest marine systems on Earth. Nutrient-heavy currents rose from the depths, carrying dissolved minerals upward, feeding blooms of plankton that in turn supported immense layers of animal life above them. What Georg Steller encountered in 1741 was not merely a collection of unusual species. He was looking into a functioning ecological structure, still operating at nearly full abundance, before industrial hunting, commercial extraction, and global maritime traffic began stripping its foundations apart. The coastlines and islands of the Bering Sea existed then as a kind of refuge system. Sea ice, distance, violent weather, and the remoteness of the North Pacific had slowed the arrival of organized exploitation. Whaling fleets had not yet transformed the region. The fur trade had not yet spread fully into the Aleutians. Large marine mammals still moved through waters where human beings remained temporary visitors rather than permanent ecological pressure. Sea otters drifted through the kelp forests in densities difficult to imagine now, their bodies wrapped in fur so dense that cold seawater never reached the skin beneath. They fed continuously on sea urchins, shellfish, and crustaceans, regulating the entire architecture of the kelp ecosystem through ordinary daily feeding. Without realizing it fully, Steller was observing one of the clearest examples on Earth of what modern ecology would later call a keystone species, an animal whose presence stabilizes countless invisible relationships around it. Near the shorelines, Steller's sea lions gathered across rocky haulouts with little instinctive caution toward approaching humans. Spectacled cormorants nested in large colonies along the coasts, their heavy dark bodies moving awkwardly across stone ledges above the surf. Beneath the surface, Pacific fish populations moved through cold currents in immense schools, while migratory seabirds crossed overhead in numbers that turned sections of the sky into shifting bands of motion. And moving slowly among the canopy kelp at the ocean surface were the sea cows, immense herbivorous mammals, grazing almost continuously through underwater forests that had supported their lineage for hundreds of thousands of years. Their feeding helped shape the structure of the kelp beds themselves. Every part of the system touched another part. Predators regulated grazers. Grazers shaped vegetation. Vegetation sheltered fish. Fish sustained birds and mammals. And all of it depended upon the cold, nutrient-rich circulation of the North Pacific. This was the ecological world surrounding the sea ape sighting. If an unknown marine mammal truly existed in those waters during the 18th century, there may never have been a better moment for human beings to encounter it. Population densities across the ecosystem were still near historical highs. Species that would later become rare or extinct remained abundant enough to occupy their full ecological roles. Small regional populations, isolated colonies, or unusual marine animals had space to persist inside an environment still functioning with immense biological complexity. That possibility does not confirm the sea ape. The absence of evidence remains where it has always been. Yet the ecological context matters because it changes the atmosphere surrounding the account. Steller was not observing a diminished ocean already simplified by centuries of extraction. He was observing an intact marine frontier during a brief interval before commercial hunting transformed the northern Pacific within only a few decades. By the 19th century, much of that abundance had already begun collapsing. Fur seals, sea otters, whales, seabirds, and sea cows all entered the long, narrowing corridor of exploitation and decline. Kelp forests shifted. Predator relationships fractured. Entire colonies vanished from coastlines where they had existed for ages beyond memory. Whether the sea ape belonged to that lost world or emerged only from the uncertainties of exhausted human perception, the ocean Steller sailed through in 1741 no longer survives in its original form. Far from shore, a northern fur seal can appear strangely detached from the ordinary image of a seal most people carry in memory. There are no crowded beaches, no barking colonies pressed against volcanic rock, no easy point of comparison against land. In open water, the animal becomes something narrower and more ambiguous, a dark moving form rising and disappearing among waves, showing only fragments of its anatomy at any given moment. This uncertainty matters because the most convincing explanation for Steller's sea ape remains not an unknown creature, but a real one already living throughout the North Pacific in immense numbers. The northern fur seal moved through the same waters surrounding the Shumagon Islands where the sighting occurred in August of 1741. Steller later documented the species carefully during the long months on Bering Island, recording details of behavior, anatomy, and ecology with the same disciplined attention visible throughout his surviving work. The irony surrounding the sea ape rests partly here in the fact that the strongest candidate for the mystery is also an animal Steller demonstrably knew well. Northern fur seals belong to the pinnipeds, yet they differ noticeably from the heavier true seals often imagined when the group is mentioned. Their bodies are more elongated and flexible, adapted for long pelagic movement across enormous distances of open ocean. Adult males can exceed 2 meters in length and weigh several hundred kilograms, while females remain dramatically smaller. Juvenile males fall between these extremes, occupying almost exactly the dimensions Steller recorded for the sea ape. Their faces contribute strongly to the resemblance he described. The skull narrows toward a pointed muzzle framed by long, pale whiskers. Large forward-facing eyes give the animal an unusually attentive expression compared to many marine mammals. Seen at a distance in low evening light, with only the head and upper body visible above water, the silhouette can appear remarkably canine. The species also behaves in ways unexpectedly close to portions of Steller's account. Northern fur seals are among the most oceanic pinnipeds on Earth, spending months at sea without returning to land. Solitary individuals, far from breeding colonies, are entirely normal. Marine biologists have documented them investigating floating objects, interacting with seaweed, and engaging in prolonged surface behavior interpreted as exploratory play. They are intelligent, visually curious animals, capable of focusing attention on unfamiliar disturbances in their environment. One behavior in particular carries striking overlap with the diary description. Fur seals have repeatedly been observed lifting themselves vertically in the water to inspect ships or nearby movement, a posture modern researchers describe as spy hopping. In calm seas, the animal can maintain this position for surprising lengths of time, exposing much of the upper torso while the lower body remains submerged. From the deck of a rolling 18th century vessel, viewed at a downward angle through shifting light, the anatomy beneath the surface could become visually distorted. Their foreflippers complicate the picture further. Unlike sea lions, fur seals can sometimes keep the forelimbs pressed closely against the body while swimming. Under certain conditions, this creates the impression of a limbless torso tapering directly into the water behind it. Some zoologists later argued that the divided tail Steller described may actually have been the paired hind flippers aligned together beneath the surface and glimpsed intermittently through moving water. Yet the explanation never settles perfectly into place. Steller emphasized the absence of visible forelimbs repeatedly and with unusual clarity. He also described a distinctly bilobed tail structure with an upper lobe larger than the lower, an arrangement difficult to reconcile cleanly with pinned anatomy. The longer the observation lasted, the more awkward the misidentification becomes. Brief sightings invite confusion easily. 2 uninterrupted hours of examination from a trained naturalist create a heavier problem. That tension explains why the fur seal theory remains persuasive without becoming absolute. Nearly every component of the account can be mapped onto known northern fur seal behavior and anatomy with varying degrees of confidence. Yet a small remainder persists beyond the edges of the fit, details that resist total alignment. In the quiet space between those mismatched pieces, the sea ape continues to survive, not as a confirmed creature, but as a description that never completely settles into certainty. More than 2 centuries after the last Steller sea cow disappeared beneath the cold surface of the Bering Sea, fragments of its body still remained locked inside bone. Deep within those mineral structures, preserved through darkness, freezing temperatures, and time itself, traces of the animal's genetic history endured quietly until modern sequencing technology became capable of reading them. In the early 21st century, scientists finally opened that record, and what emerged from it changed the story of the sea cow from a simple extinction narrative into something older and far more layered. The genomic reconstruction, published in 2021, represented the first complete nuclear genome assembled for the species. Using ancient bone material recovered from the Commander Islands, researchers achieved a remarkably detailed sequence coverage, dense enough to reconstruct long demographic patterns hidden across hundreds of thousands of years. The work transformed the sea cow from a historical anecdote preserved in journals into a measurable biological population with an evolutionary history written directly into its DNA. One of the most striking findings involved heterozygosity, the degree of genetic variation present inside a population. Healthy, widespread populations usually contain large amounts of variation, allowing resilience against disease, environmental change, and random mutation. The Commander Islands sea cows showed the opposite pattern. Their heterozygosity was extraordinarily low, comparable to the final isolated woolly mammoths that survived on Wrangel Island until roughly 4,000 years ago. In practical terms, this meant the sea cows Steller encountered in 1741 were already descendants of a population that had remained small and genetically restricted for an immense span of time. The genome also revealed evidence of a major demographic collapse approximately 400,000 years ago, long before human beings entered the North Pacific. Climate fluctuations during the Middle Pleistocene altered sea levels, ocean temperatures, and the distribution of kelp forests across the region. The sea cow population appears to have contracted severely during that interval and never fully recovered afterward. By the time European ships finally reached the Commander Islands, the species had already been retreating through geological time for hundreds of millennia. Earlier fossil evidence suggests that Steller sea cows once occupied much of the North Pacific Rim, extending from the waters near Japan through the Aleutians and down toward the coast of California. The genomic work supports the idea that these populations gradually fragmented during repeated glacial cycles. Isolated groups became separated from one another by changing ocean conditions and shifting habitat boundaries until only the remote Commander Islands population remained. In this light, the extinction observed after Steller's publication becomes both sudden and ancient at the same time. Human hunting eliminated the final herd with shocking speed, yet the vulnerability had been accumulating long before the first Russian vessel entered the region. The species was already carrying the genetic signature of prolonged isolation and ecological contraction. Another discovery emerging from later genomic analysis connected directly back to Steller's own descriptions. In 2022, researchers identified pseudogenized forms of two genes associated in humans with severe inherited skin disorders. The malfunctioning versions found in the sea cow genome would likely have produced thickened, roughened skin remarkably similar to the bark-like texture Steller described in Debestius marinis. A detail written by candlelight on a remote island during the 18th century found confirmation centuries later at the molecular level. The observation proved so anatomically precise that modern genetics could recognize it. The implications stretched beyond the species itself. A separate ecological study proposed what researchers called the ghost hypothesis, the idea that sea cows may have shaped North Pacific kelp forests so profoundly through continuous grazing that modern ecosystems still bear structural traces of their absence. By feeding near the canopy, the animals may have altered light penetration, nutrient cycling, and kelp growth patterns across enormous coastal regions for thousands of years. If that hypothesis is correct, then the disappearance of the sea cow was not merely the loss of a single marine mammal. It was the removal of a living ecological force whose influence may still echo invisibly through northern Pacific waters, long after the animal itself passed beyond memory. Across museums and university collections, fragments of the Steller sea cow remain scattered quietly inside drawers and climate-controlled rooms, ribs longer than a human body, vertebrae worn smooth by centuries, pieces of an animal that vanished before the modern scientific world had fully formed around it. For generations, these remains functioned mainly as evidence of loss, physical confirmation that a giant marine herbivore once drifted through northern kelp forests and then disappeared with astonishing speed. In recent years, however, the bones have begun acquiring a different role. They are now treated not only as fossils of extinction, but as reservoirs of biological information that might someday contribute to reversing it. In late 2022, a Russian initiative called Arctic Sirenia announced an explicit ambition to revive the Steller sea cow through genome engineering. Funded by entrepreneur Sergei Bakin and involving a group of researchers interested in de-extinction biology, the proposal rested on techniques that until recently belonged almost entirely to speculative fiction. The central idea was not to clone the sea cow directly, since no intact living cells survive, but to reconstruct aspects of its genome through editing the DNA of its closest living relative, the dugong. Modern gene editing systems such as CRISPR have made it increasingly possible to alter specific genetic sequences with remarkable precision. In theory, enough modifications applied across the dugong genome could gradually shift developmental traits toward those associated with the extinct sea cow: body size, metabolism, skin structure, blubber distribution, feeding anatomy, and cold water adaptation. The eventual goal would not be a perfect resurrection of the original species, something likely impossible after centuries of absence, but an organism approximating the ecological and anatomical role once occupied by Hydrodamylus gigas. Even stated calmly, the technical challenges surrounding such a project remain immense. The dugong itself is already a threatened marine mammal with declining populations across parts of its modern range. Any experimental reproductive program would therefore involve an animal already under conservation pressure. Beyond that lies the far more difficult problem of gestation. No living surrogate species remotely matches the size and biology of the extinct sea cow. Researchers have discussed possibilities involving artificial gestation systems, yet no artificial womb currently exists capable of supporting a marine mammal embryo of this scale and developmental complexity through a full reproductive cycle. The broader field of de-extinction offers only partial precedents. Projects involving the woolly mammoth and the thylacine have demonstrated meaningful early progress in genome assembly, cell engineering, and developmental biology, but none have yet produced a functioning, resurrected population. The science has advanced enough to move beyond fantasy, though not nearly far enough to guarantee success. And even if the biological obstacles were overcome, another quieter complication remains waiting in the water itself. The ecosystem that sustained the Steller sea cow no longer exists in the same form. The North Pacific has changed profoundly since the 18th century. Commercial hunting reduced sea otter populations to a tiny fraction of their historical abundance before legal protections slowly allowed partial recovery. Kelp forests have shifted under changing predator relationships, warming waters, fisheries pressure, and ecological restructuring that unfolded across centuries. Entire feedback systems, once maintained by large marine herbivores, may already be gone. A recreated sea cow entering the modern Bering Sea would not be returning home to the same ocean Steller described. It would be arriving in a transformed ecological landscape shaped by industrial history, climate change, and the disappearance of many interconnected species. The question would no longer concern biology alone, but whether an extinct ecological role can still exist after the surrounding system has been altered for generations. Yet, the existence of the project itself carries a strange historical symmetry. The notes Steller wrote during 9 isolated months on Bering Island helped expose the sea cow to exploitation and extinction within less than 3 decades. Now, centuries later, those same observations, combined with fragments of preserved DNA, form the foundation of an attempt to bring some version of the animal back into the world. The possibility remains uncertain, distant, and technically fragile. Still, somewhere inside laboratories and research proposals, the outline of the sea cow has begun moving once more beneath the surface of human thought. Long after the wreck of the street Peter disappeared beneath storms and memory, the animals Georg Steller described continued moving through the North Pacific, though not with the abundance he once recorded. Some vanished entirely into museum drawers and old field notes. Others remained alive, scattered across coastlines and volcanic islands, carrying the weight of ecological changes that unfolded slowly across centuries. Their survival has not been simple continuity. It has become a kind of prolonged narrowing, populations shrinking, ranges fragmenting, behaviors adapting to oceans increasingly shaped by industry, noise, warming currents, and human extraction. Among the largest of these survivors is the stellar sea lion, Eumetopius jubatus, the heaviest member of the eared seal family. Adult males can exceed 3 meters in length and weigh more than 1,000 kilograms. Massive animals with thick necks, coarse fur, and deep vocal calls that carry across fog and surf. During the months on Bering Island, Steller observed them closely enough to describe their breeding colonies, their social organization, and the heavy movements of bulls defending territory along rocky shorelines. He wrote about them not as isolated specimens, but as part of a functioning coastal world, woven into the rhythm of the northern Pacific. That world has altered dramatically since then. The western population of Steller sea lions, especially those distributed through the Aleutians and nearby waters closest to Steller's own observations, experienced one of the sharpest marine mammal declines of the late 20th century. Since the 1970s, numbers in some regions fell by more than 70%. Beaches once crowded with breeding colonies grew quieter. Researchers proposed multiple explanations, none fully complete on its own. Commercial fishing reduced prey availability across parts of the ecosystem. Entanglement in fishing gear injured adults and juveniles alike. Changing ocean temperatures altered fish distributions. Shifts in killer whale predation may also have contributed, pressing additional pressure onto already stressed populations. The uncertainty surrounding the decline carries its own quiet significance. Even with satellites, acoustic monitoring, aerial surveys, and modern marine biology, the North Pacific still resists simple explanation. Farther north, another of Steller's recorded animals survives in colder silence. Steller's eider, Polysticta stelleri, is a small Arctic sea duck marked by pale plumage, dark patterning, and seasonal migrations stretching across frozen coastlines. Steller described the species during the same broad period of exploration that produced his observations of sea lions and sea cows, adding another thread to the growing biological map of the region. Today, the Alaskan breeding population has declined severely enough for the species to receive threatened status within the United States. Habitat pressures, environmental shifts, and changing Arctic conditions all appear connected, though the exact mechanisms remain only partly understood. Above these waters still flies the Steller sea eagle, Haliaeetus pelagicus, immense even among eagles, with a wingspan that can approach 2.5 meters. Its heavy yellow beak and stark black and white plumage remain among the most striking visual forms in the northern Pacific ecosystem. Yet even this great predator now exists in relatively small numbers, with the global population estimated at only a few thousand individuals. The species is considered near threatened, vulnerable to habitat alteration, poisoning, and the broader instability affecting northern coastal systems. Seen together, the pattern surrounding Steller's animals no longer resembles coincidence. The sea cow disappeared entirely. The spectacled cormorant followed. Sea otters collapsed toward extinction before partial recovery. Sea lions declined. Eiders weakened. Eagles narrowed toward vulnerability. Each species reflects a different ecological pressure: hunting, industrial expansion, prey collapse, climate disruption, habitat fragmentation, yet all belong to the same northern ocean. Steller entered in the 18th century. His voyage did not create every change that followed, but it marked the beginning of a profound opening. Trade routes expanded, hunting fleets arrived. Commercial extraction spread through islands and coastlines that had once existed at the edge of European knowledge. The names attached to Steller's discoveries now read less like a catalogue of triumph than a long ecological ledger each species carrying some visible trace of the centuries that followed his passage through the North Pacific. By the close of the 18th century, the northern Pacific had begun to transform from an isolated ecological frontier into an industrial hunting corridor. Ships crossed waters that, only decades earlier, had held enormous concentrations of marine mammals and seabirds living with little sustained exposure to human predation. Fur traders, whalers, and provisioning crews moved from island to island carrying the assumptions of the age that the ocean was too large to empty, too productive to exhaust, too alive to fail. The destruction that followed rarely appeared catastrophic in a single season. It unfolded as accumulation, each voyage removing another layer from ecosystems that had formed over thousands of years. The Steller sea cow disappeared first. By 1768, scarcely more than a quarter century after its scientific description, the last confirmed individual had been killed along the shores of Bering Island. Hunters pursuing fur seals and sea otters relied on the giant herbivores as a stable food source during long expeditions. The animals floated close to shore, moved slowly, traveled in groups, and lacked any evolved fear of humans. Their enormous bodies, once adapted for grazing cold kelp forests in relative safety, became liabilities in a world suddenly crowded with harpoons and commercial demand. The spectacled cormorant followed during the next century. Large, heavy, and almost flightless, it nested on isolated islands where generations had passed without land predators. Steller's own notes described birds so unwary that starving sailors could approach them directly for food. By approximately 1850, the species had vanished entirely. No complete behavioral record survived beyond the fragments written during the Bering Island winter. Bones, skins, and scattered specimens became the only remaining traces of the largest cormorant ever known. Elsewhere, across northern waters, similar disappearances unfolded. The Labrador duck, another coastal species shaped by specialized habitat and limited distribution, vanished by 1878. In the North Atlantic, ecologically distant yet hauntingly parallel, the great auk disappeared by 1844. Like the spectacled cormorant, it had evolved in isolation from terrestrial predators. It nested densely, moved awkwardly on land, and met industrial hunting pressure with almost no defensive instinct. The pattern repeated itself across oceans with unsettling consistency. Large-bodied species, island specialists, flightless birds, slow-breeding mammals, and animals unafraid of humans disappeared first. Sea otters approached the same threshold. Their fur, containing the densest hair structure of any known mammal, became one of the most valuable commodities in the maritime trade linking Russia, China, Europe, and eventually the expanding economies of the Pacific coast. Hunting fleets spread rapidly through the Aleutians and beyond. Entire coastlines were stripped of otters over successive decades. By the early 20th century, from an original population likely numbering several hundred thousand, perhaps only 1,000 to 2,000 individuals remained alive. Recovery began only after international agreements, such as the North Pacific Fur Seal Convention of 1911, and later, legal protections slowed the pace of extraction. What connected these extinctions and collapses was not simply hunting intensity, but ecological vulnerability shaped over evolutionary time. Many northern Pacific species evolved in environments where large terrestrial predators were absent or rare. Islands favored tameness, colonial nesting, slow movement, and reduced fear responses. Marine abundance reinforced the illusion of permanence. To 18th and 19th century commercial expeditions, the animals appeared inexhaustible precisely because they had once existed within stable systems that rarely experienced rapid collapse. The Bering Island ecosystem encountered by Steller in 1741 now appears less like an untouched wilderness and more like a final surviving fragment of an older planetary arrangement. Kelp forests stretched across cold, nutrient-rich seas shaped for millennia by sea otters, sea cows, seabirds, and marine predators interacting in enormous abundance. Much of that structure had already endured climatic upheaval since the Ice Age, yet remained standing when the street peter drifted into those waters. What followed was not a single extinction event, but a long dismantling. The Ice Age narrowed the old northern ecosystems gradually through changing climates and shifting coastlines. Commercial hunting completed the process with astonishing speed, compressing centuries of ecological loss into the span of a few human generations. On cold oceans, uncertainty survives longer than certainty. Bones decay, coastlines shift, populations collapse, and entire ecological worlds pass out of living memory before science has time to fully describe them. The sea ape exists within that narrow region between observation and proof, where natural history becomes difficult to separate from absence itself. Whether Georg Steller truly encountered an unknown animal in the North Pacific or misinterpreted a familiar one under unusual conditions, the fate of the case reveals something important about the structure of science and the kinds of knowledge it can preserve. Taxonomy was built to resist confusion. From its earliest modern foundations, naturalists understood how easily rumor, exaggeration, and imagination could contaminate the scientific record. Travelers returned from distant seas, describing dragons, mermaids, giant serpents, and impossible beasts, stitched together from fear, distance, poor lighting, and fragmented observation. By the 19th century, the solution had hardened into procedure. A species required a type specimen, a physical body preserved and cataloged, so future scientists could examine the same evidence directly. Without that anchor, classification drifted towards speculation. The system worked precisely because it was cautious. Yet every rule designed to protect accuracy also creates a boundary beyond which certain things cannot enter the formal record. Animals that are rare, elusive, deep-dwelling, geographically isolated, or simply never collected remain suspended outside official recognition, regardless of whether they truly exist. The requirement for physical proof filters error, but it also filters possibility. In most cases, that trade is worthwhile. In some cases, it leaves permanent gaps. The coelacanth offers one example. For millions of years, the fish existed only as fossils pressed into ancient stone. Paleontologists believed the lineage extinct since long before the rise of modern humans. Then, in 1938, a living specimen surfaced unexpectedly in fishing nets off South Africa. The animal had continued moving through deep ocean waters unnoticed by formal science for an immense span of time. Without that captured specimen, the living population would have remained invisible to taxonomy indefinitely, despite existing all along beneath the surface of the Indian Ocean. The giant squid occupied a similarly uncertain territory for centuries. Sailors described enormous tentacled creatures rising from black water long before marine biology accepted the full reality of architeuthis ducks. Fragments washed ashore. Beaks appeared inside whale stomachs. Tangled remains surfaced in fishing gear. Yet live adults remained almost entirely unseen. The species drifted through scientific literature like a shadow attached to partial evidence and reluctant belief. Only in 2004 did researchers finally photograph a living giant squid in its natural environment, confirming directly what generations of indirect evidence had long suggested. The sea ape never crossed that threshold. No body washed ashore, no skeleton entered a museum collection, no skin, skull, or preserved tissue survived to anchor the description materially. There remained only Steller's written account, anatomically organized, unusually detailed, composed by one of the most reliable field observers of the 18th century, yet permanently incomplete by the standards required for formal recognition. Once the classification attempts of the late 18th and early 19th centuries failed, the question hardened into irresolution. What science lost in closing the case was not necessarily a hidden species. It lost access to an answer. That distinction matters. The sea ape did not become false through disproof. It became unreachable through time. The North Pacific ecosystem Steller entered in 1741 no longer exists in the same form. Hunting transformed coastlines. Species disappeared. Populations collapsed. Ecological relationships unraveled. If an unusual marine mammal once moved through those waters, whether as a rare individual, a malformed seal, an isolated remnant population, or something genuinely undocumented, the conditions that might have allowed future confirmation vanished long ago. Now the account remains suspended in a narrow historical silence, neither accepted nor entirely dismissed, carried forward only through a few hundred words written by a dying expedition naturalist leaning over the railing of a ship drifting home across the cold Pacific. An ecosystem can continue functioning long after part of it has disappeared. Waves still move across the shoreline. Kelp forests still rise through cold water. Fish still travel beneath volcanic islands. To a passing ship, the North Pacific may appear eternal, unchanged except for weather and season. Yet ecology carries memory differently than human history. It remembers through imbalance, through altered energy flow, through missing relationships that once shaped every layer of the environment. Modern ecology describes these processes through the idea of the trophic cascade, the chain reaction that spreads through an ecosystem when a major species is removed. The concept sounds abstract until it is traced across the waters Georg Steller crossed in the 18th century. There, the relationships between sea otters, sea urchins, kelp forests, seabirds, sea lions, and sea cows formed one of the clearest interconnected marine systems on Earth. Each species influenced the survival and behavior of the others, often indirectly, through pressures distributed across food webs and habitat structure over thousands of years. Sea otters occupied one of the central positions in that system. Their predation controlled sea urchin populations, preventing the dense grazing fronts that can strip kelp forests from the seafloor upward. When the fur trade drove otters toward near extinction, those restraints weakened. Urchin populations expanded rapidly across many coastal regions, consuming vast sections of kelp habitat. The change did not happen instantly everywhere, but over time entire underwater forests thinned, fragmented, or vanished. For the Steller sea cow, this mattered profoundly. The giant herbivore depended on dense canopy kelp growing near the surface, feeding continuously on the upper layers of those forests because its buoyant body prevented deep diving. Long before the final hunting parties killed the remaining sea cows on Bering Island, the ecological foundation supporting the species may already have been deteriorating. The destruction of sea otter populations likely altered the very kelp systems the sea cows required to survive. This is extinction viewed not as an isolated event, but as structural unraveling. The 2021 study, exploring what researchers called the sea cow's ghost ecology, approached the problem from this perspective. The authors proposed multiple ways a 10-ton marine herbivore could have shaped kelp ecosystems across the North Pacific over evolutionary timescales. Continuous grazing near the canopy may have altered light penetration through kelp forests, affecting algae and smaller organisms beneath. Nutrient movement through feeding and waste production may have influenced coastal productivity. The physical disturbance created by enormous animals moving slowly through dense kelp could have changed habitat structure for fish, invertebrates, and seabirds. The absence of those functions leaves marks that persist even after the animal itself disappears. Modern kelp forests, therefore, are not pristine remnants of an ancient baseline. They are ecosystems already transformed by loss. The sea cow vanished. Sea otters nearly vanished. The spectacled cormorant disappeared entirely, removing a major seabird predator from island food webs. Stellar sea lion populations declined sharply across large portions of their range. Each reduction altered ecological pressures in subtle, overlapping ways, redistributing energy through the system like tension shifting through an enormous net. What Steller observed from the deck of the Street Peter belonged to this older arrangement, a North Pacific still operating at nearly full ecological complexity. The significance of that moment lies not only in the individual animals he recorded, but in the relationships connecting them. Sea cows feeding through kelp canopies, otters controlling urchins below, seabirds crowding cliffs overhead, sea lions hauling onto isolated beaches, fish moving through nutrient-rich currents beneath all of it. Even the unresolved sea ape sighting existed within that wider living structure, emerging from waters crowded with interactions no longer fully present today. Within only a few decades of Steller's return to Kamchatka, much of that complexity began collapsing under the weight of extraction and ecological disruption. The ocean remained vast, but the system itself had changed. What survives now is not the untouched North Pacific of 1741, but an altered descendant carrying the quiet imprint of everything removed from it. Across the surviving pages of Georg Steller's journals, beneath the anatomical measurements and species descriptions, there runs a quieter current that feels unusual for the 18th century. Many naturalists of his era approached distant landscapes with the confidence of catalogers, treating unfamiliar animals as resources to be classified, collected, traded, or consumed. Steller certainly worked within that tradition. He dissected specimens, preserved skins, measured bones, and wrote with the disciplined precision expected of a scientific observer. Yet threaded through his accounts is another awareness, less formal and more difficult to name, a recurring recognition that the creatures surrounding him existed within conditions far more delicate than the expedition itself understood. He noticed tameness constantly. When Steller described the sea cow drifting near shore in slow family groups, he did not celebrate how easily the animals could be approached. Instead, his observations carry a restrained unease. The sea cows lacked fear because, for most of their evolutionary history, they had little reason to possess it. The Commander Islands contained no large terrestrial predators. Human hunting pressure had been absent long enough for caution itself to fade from behavior. Reading the account now, the vulnerability feels visible between the lines. Steller seemed to recognize that an animal unable to imagine danger could not survive contact with commercial extraction for very long. A similar tension appears in his observations of sea otters during the Bering Island winter. The surviving crew hunted them extensively for fur and food, activities Steller recorded with the factual detachment expected of a field naturalist. Yet he also lingered on details that another observer might have ignored entirely. He wrote about the way nearby otters gathered when one was killed. He described the persistence of animals remaining near wounded companions instead of fleeing immediately. These were not sentimental additions. He presented them as behavioral facts, carefully observed and worthy of preservation in the scientific record. The sea cows received the same treatment. Steller described harpooned individuals struggling while nearby animals circled them repeatedly, attempting to push the injured body away from hunters or dislodge the harpoons embedded in flesh. He did not interpret the behavior through moral language. The conceptual framework, modern ecology, or conservation biology, did not yet exist. Extinction itself was not widely understood as a process humans could cause systematically. Nature, in the prevailing worldview of the time, appeared effectively inexhaustible, and yet his descriptions contain the texture of someone perceiving connections his century lacked the vocabulary to express. He understood that species were linked to one another through habitat and behavior. He understood that isolation shaped animal temperaments. He understood that exploitation spread rapidly once commercial routes opened into previously inaccessible ecosystems. Most strikingly, he paid close attention to the emotional and social behaviors of animals at a time when many naturalists dismissed such observations as irrelevant or anthropomorphic. His writing rarely feels triumphant. More often, it carries the atmosphere of a witness recording something fragile before it changes. Then the record fractures. Steller died at only 37 years old while traveling across Siberia under arrest, far from the islands and oceans that defined his scientific life. Many of the specimens he collected disappeared before reaching St. Petersburg. No authenticated portrait of him survives. The sea cow vanished within decades of his death. The spectacled cormorant followed not long afterward. Much of the living world he documented collapsed before modern ecology had even formed as a discipline capable of explaining what had happened. Now, centuries later, genomic sequencing can identify the precise mutations responsible for the bark-like skin texture he described from direct observation on Bering Island. Researchers can reconstruct ancient population declines from fragments of preserved bone. De-extinction projects discuss the possibility of recreating some approximation of the sea cow itself through gene editing technologies unimaginable in the 18th century. The contrast creates a strange continuity across time. A naturalist, standing on a cold shoreline in 1741, recording the texture of skin, the movement of kelp grazers, the behavior of grieving animals, has become connected to laboratories sequencing ancient DNA nearly 3 centuries later. The language changed, the instruments changed. The scale of scientific knowledge expanded beyond anything Steller could have conceived. Yet the core act remained the same, a human observer trying carefully to understand a living world already beginning to disappear around him. There is something almost weightless about the surviving description of the sea ape. No preserved skeleton rests in a museum drawer. No weathered skin hangs beneath archival glass. No jawbone, tooth, vertebra, or strand of fur survived the crossing between observation and proof. The entire creature occupies only a small space in history, a brief passage written in ink by a dying expedition naturalist drifting through the North Pacific in 1741. And yet that fragile description endured while so many heavier, more tangible things disappeared around it. The sea ape is often framed as a zoological mystery, an unresolved identification problem waiting for classification. But beneath the anatomy and speculation lies another question entirely, one less concerned with species names than with the strange relationship between evidence and survival. Georg Steller documented the sea cow in extraordinary detail. He measured its proportions, studied its feeding behavior, examined its skin, described its social structure, and watched entire family groups moving through the kelp forests around Bering Island. The result was one of the most complete natural histories of a marine mammal produced in the 18th century. That precision made the animal visible to science, and visibility made it accessible to commerce. Within decades, the sea cow was gone, reduced now to scattered bones, genomic sequences, and descriptions preserved in academic literature. The spectacled cormorant followed a similar path. Once alive in immense black colonies along the Commander Islands, it survives today only through a handful of preserved museum skins and skeletal fragments. Fewer than 10 confirmed specimens remain worldwide. Even the surviving animals associated with Steller exist within systems of monitoring, conservation law, population decline graphs, and threatened status assessments. The Steller sea lion persists, but under pressure. The Steller eider remains vulnerable. The sea eagle stands near threatened. Their existence is measurable, documented, and fragile all at once. The sea ape alone escaped that machinery. Because it lacked a specimen, it could not enter formal taxonomy securely. Because it could not enter taxonomy securely, it could not become economically useful in the same way. No organized hunt targeted it. No commercial fleet crossed oceans searching for its oil, skin, feathers, or fur. It existed in a narrow territory between observation and uncertainty, too insubstantial for science to accept completely and too uncertain for exploitation to pursue efficiently. In that sense, the sea ape occupies a strange inversion within the history of natural knowledge. Every confirmed animal Steller encountered became vulnerable precisely because it could be demonstrated physically. Bones could be weighed, fur could be sold, meat could be salted, populations could be mapped and harvested. Scientific recognition and commercial extraction moved together through the 18th century North Pacific almost as a single process. The sea ape slipped through that process because it never fully crossed the threshold into material certainty. This does not mean the creature was real in the biological sense, nor does it prove the opposite. The uncertainty remains intact. A juvenile fur seal beneath unusual lighting conditions may still explain the entire account. A malformed pinniped may have produced the impression of something stranger than it truly was. An unknown animal cannot be ruled in, but it cannot be ruled out entirely either. The point is not resolution. The point is the unusual shape the unresolved question leaves behind. A documented species enters history physically. It acquires names, measurements, classifications, trade value, ecological analysis, and eventually conservation status or extinction dates. The sea ape never completed that transition. It remained suspended as narrative rather than specimen. And so the smallest entry in Steller's surviving journals became, in an odd way, the only one untouched by disappearance. The sea cow can vanish because bones can become empty beaches. A cormorant can vanish because colonies can fall silent. A population graph can decline toward zero. But a paragraph in a dead man's diary occupies a different kind of existence. If the sea ape was nothing at all, then its very uncertainty may have been the only form of protection any creature in Steller's North Pacific ever truly possessed. By the time Georg Steller leaned over the railings of the Street Peter in the North Pacific, much of his life had already narrowed into hardship. He traveled under the authority of an expedition commander who distrusted him. He worked in cold that stiffened ink and fingers alike. Around him moved exhausted sailors, carrying scurvy through their bodies like a slow tide, each day wearing away another layer of strength. Shorelines appeared and vanished with almost no opportunity to explore them. Yet within those constraints, Steller maintained a kind of disciplined attention that now feels almost impossible in its patience. When the expedition reached Kayak Island in July of 1741, Steller was granted only a handful of hours ashore before the ship prepared to leave again. In that brief interval, he moved through forests, shorelines, and tidal edges collecting plants, observing birds, recording geographic details, and identifying patterns that connected the land not to Asia but to North America. Modern biographers still describe those 10 hours as one of the most concentrated episodes of field observation in 18th century natural history. What makes the achievement remarkable is not simply the amount he recorded, but the manner in which he recorded it. His writing reveals a habit of looking slowly. He watched the behavior of animals instead of only collecting their bodies. He paid attention to feeding patterns, social groupings, vocalizations, movement, reactions to injury, and the subtle ways organisms related to the environment around them. Long before ecology existed formally as a scientific discipline, Steller was already observing the living fabric connecting species together. The list of animals he documented now reads almost like an inventory from another Earth. Sea cows moving through kelp forests, broad as floating meadows. Vast sea otter populations drifting in sheltered waters with no fear of approaching humans. Immense cormorants standing along rocky coastlines. Sea lions gathered in dense colonies. Eagles circling shorelines above cold volcanic islands. Fur seals crossing open water through fog and current. A blue forest jay flashing between spruce branches on the edge of a continent Europeans barely understood. Together, these observations form something larger than species descriptions. They became a record of an ecosystem operating near its full historical abundance before industrial hunting and commercial extraction reshaped the North Pacific. Much of that world now survives only in fragments. Some species vanished completely. Others persist in reduced populations within altered habitats. The ecological relationships Steller observed remain present, but diminished, quieter, carrying the pressure of centuries that followed his voyage. And always at the margins of those observations sits the sea ape, uncertain and unresolved, preserved not in bone, but in prose. It occupies the edge of Steller's documentary record, like a figure standing just outside the range of lantern light, never approaching close enough to settle permanently into certainty. Modern science often creates the impression that the natural world has already been cataloged completely, that the age of first encounters belongs only to earlier centuries. But the ocean has resisted that illusion repeatedly. The Census of Marine Life, completed in 2010 after a decade of international research, estimated that the vast majority of marine species remain formally undescribed. Deep sea expeditions continue retrieving organisms unlike anything previously cataloged. Entire lineages emerge unexpectedly from genetic analysis. Even large marine mammals continue to surprise researchers. New species of beaked whale, animals breathing air and surfacing in open ocean were formally described as recently as 2016 and 2021. The sea has not become easier to know since 1741. What changed instead was the condition of the water itself. Commercial fishing, Industrial shipping, warming oceans, acoustic pollution, plastic contamination, and collapsing food webs have transformed marine ecosystems across the planet. The concealment remains. The abundance does not. In that sense, the question surrounding the sea ape is no longer primarily about Georg Steller's reliability as an observer. It has become a quieter question about the world through which he sailed, and about what kinds of life can continue existing once an ocean loses the vastness and ecological complexity that once allowed so many things to remain unseen. Evening settles differently over the North Pacific than it does over enclosed seas. The light does not disappear quickly. It stretches itself thin across the water, pale gold fading into iron gray, every wave carrying the last of the sun farther west. On August 10th, 1741, the street, Peter moves through that fading light with the exhausted heaviness of a ship already beginning to come apart. Salt has dried into the wood, sails strain softly overhead. Somewhere below deck, men lie in darkness with gums swollen from scurvy, bodies failing molecule by molecule from the long absence of fresh food and land. The expedition is still trying to reach home, though the word itself has become uncertain. Vitus Bering is ill beyond recovery, confined increasingly to his quarters, while the crew drifts between duty, fear, and fatigue. Around them extends an ocean, almost untouched by the systems of extraction that will later transform it. Kelp forests rise beneath cold currents. Fur seals cross open water in enormous migrations. Sea otters drift through sheltered coastlines, still unaware that human commerce has discovered their fur. At the railing stands Georg Steller, 32 years old, carrying notebooks already crowded with observations gathered under impossible conditions. He has spent months looking carefully at a world few European scientists have ever seen directly. Every coastline, bird call, feeding pattern, and current matters to him. Even now, with the expedition decaying around him, he continues watching, and something watches back. The animal appears near the surface in the angled evening light, moving beside the ship with a calm persistence that separates it from the ordinary rhythms of surrounding wildlife. Steller studies the shape carefully. Dog-like head, long whiskers, elongated body, no visible forelimbs, a divided tail trailing behind it in two uneven lobes. The creature remains near the vessel long enough for sustained observation, surfacing, circling, returning again as though curious about the drifting structure crossing its water. Everything that survives of the encounter will eventually contract into a paragraph. Steller cannot know this while he watches. He cannot know that 6 years remain before fever kills him on a Siberian road far from the Pacific. He cannot know that the sea cows he has not yet encountered on Bering Island already stand near the end of a long extinction process that began hundreds of thousands of years earlier. He cannot know that the spectacled cormorants feeding his starving shipmates through the coming winter will vanish entirely within a century. He cannot know that future scientists will sequence ancient DNA from sea cow bones and discover genetic evidence confirming the extraordinary accuracy of his observations down to the texture of an animal's skin. Nor can he know that this single, unexplained sighting will drift through centuries without resolution. Naturalists will try to classify it. Taxonomists will move it between sirens, manatees, and imaginary marine mammals. Other scientists will dismiss it as a fur seal seen under unusual conditions. A sailor in the Aleutians more than 2 centuries later will record a strangely similar encounter. The debate will continue quietly through journals, footnotes, biographies, and museum discussions, never fully disappearing and never fully settling into certainty. For one brief moment on the water, though, none of that exists yet. There is only the ship, the fading sun, and the animal itself. Steller lifts his gun and fires. The shot breaks across the evening like a crack through glass. Smoke drifts outward into the cold air. The animal vanishes beneath the surface before the sound has finished echoing away from the hull. Nothing is recovered. No specimen floats upward. No second encounter follows. The ocean closes again almost immediately, carrying the uncertainty down into itself. What Steller actually saw cannot now be answered completely. The ecosystem surrounding that moment has been transformed too thoroughly by hunting, extinction, climate shifts, and centuries of industrial pressure. The North Pacific he crossed in 1741 no longer exists in its original form, but the description survived. 5 feet long, dog-like head, no visible forelimbs, a divided tail, the upper lobe larger than the lower, curious behavior beside the ship, watching. Whatever moved through the water that evening remained visible only for a little while. Then the sea took it back.